Hey guys, tonight, we're slipping past the velvet curtains of history and stepping into chambers most textbooks skip into the bedrooms of kings, queens, and emperors. Picture flickering oil lamps casting golden shadows across marble floors, the hush of silk robes gliding over skin, and secrets whispered between breaths that could make or break an empire. We're talking about intimacy behind ancient thrones, not the kind plastered in myths or censored in classrooms, but the kind that ruled dynasties from beneath feathered canopies and behind perfumed veils. And fair warning, in these corridors of ancient power, consent can be optional. Affection is currency, and betrayal often sleeps in your bed. You probably won't survive this without raising an eyebrow. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening from somewhere cozy right now, drop your city and local time in the comments. I love knowing where you're tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in a long, low corridor, heavy with incense and secrets. This is not a battlefield or a Senate hall, it's more dangerous. This is where empires are conceived, sometimes literally. Ancient thrones were rarely warmed by love. You tiptoe through time, starting in the great courts of early civilization, where pleasure was never private, and intimacy was a public performance, if not a political negotiation. There were no couples therapists in the palace. If you wanted to get ahead, you did it in bed with a calculated smile and a backup plan involving poisoned wine. In ancient palaces, whether carved from sandstone or quarried marble, the royal bedchamber doubled as a war room. You're there now, pressed against the cool stone of a wall, while a servant silently changes the sheets that still hold last night's imperial bargaining. That scent in the air, musk, rose water, and ambition. Rulers didn't marry for love, they married for land leverage and legacy. You might imagine candlelit confessions and moonlit touches, but the truth is far more transactional. A prince might be bartered away like barley. A princess even more valuable, because if she bore a child, that child could unite kingdoms, or at least prevent another war. For a while. Still, intimacy wasn't just for alliance building, it was entertainment. Imagine being summoned to a royal banquet, then being expected to watch the king and queen retire with the curtains open just a little. Not too much. Just enough to remind the nobles who held the reins of virility and legitimacy. And oh, the audience mattered. If a king couldn't produce an heir, whispers would snake down the halls faster than a servant with a spilled secret. Impotent, they'd murmur. Not a great look when your entire empire's stability depends on your ability to impregnate someone by spring. Some rulers dealt with this pressure by doubling or decupling down. Enter the harem. Now don't confuse these with exotic fantasy tales. You slide open the painted screen and peek in, not into pleasure gardens, but into a political pressure cooker disguised with perfume and poetry. Dozens, sometimes hundreds of women, each vying for one thing, a single night that could crown them queen mother, or get them exiled the next day. You notice how silent they are, how poised, each step measured, every glance calculated. They aren't here for love, they're here to survive. If they can seduce the ruler and carry his child, jackpot. But one misstep, and it's off to the coldest wing of the palace. Or worse. It wasn't always women playing the game. You catch sight of a eunuch adjusting the emperor's pillows, men surgically altered to ensure they posed no threat, but held plenty of secrets. Eunuchs often held more palace knowledge than generals. They knew which concubine was in favor, who snuck into whose chamber, and when the queen pretended to be asleep, just long enough for her real lover to slip in. Historians still argue whether eunuchs were trustworthy confidants or back-channel puppet masters. What's certain, they had access. And in royal courts, access was everything. Sometimes, though, intimacy transcended politics. Rarely, yes, but occasionally a ruler fell for someone far beneath their station. A slave, a bard, a court jester with particularly clever jokes. And that's when things got messy. Because loving outside your caste or class could ignite more than just candle flames. It could torch reputations, dynasties, even whole cities. One fringe tale from a Sumerian tablet hints at a high priestess who seduced a king to manipulate a temple alliance. The tablet crumbles before the ending, leaving scholars to debate, was she a traitor or a hero in heels? Either way, the story survived for 4,000 years. That's what you call impact. You wander further into the chamber, past draped couches and fading tapestries. On the walls, carvings show gods entwined with mortals, part divine erotica, part propaganda. Because if a ruler could claim their bloodline descended from a god's loins, suddenly their authority was unquestionable. Not because of strategy, because of seduction. Heaven-approved seduction, no less. That brings us to another truth. Most scrolls skip intimacy rituals weren't always private. In some early societies, sexual rites were part of public festivals. You pass a stone amphitheater and hear chanting watch as a sacred marriage between king and priestess plays out for the crowd. Awkward, maybe. Symbolic, definitely. The union promised prosperity, rainfall, and a healthy harvest. It's difficult to farm when the gods think your ruler's a prude. But just as often, the intimacy was false, fabricated in whispers to cover up infertility affairs or political instability. One ancient queen reportedly faked pregnancy by stuffing her robes with soft fruit. She miscarried when it became inconvenient. Historians still argue whether it was a strategic move or a desperate one. Either way, it worked for a while. As you linger in this golden hush of ancient intimacy, one thing becomes clear: the bedchamber wasn't just a place to sleep. It was a throne without arms or legs where power changed hands and sometimes hearts under embroidered covers. So go ahead, get comfy under your own blankets tonight. But maybe glance behind the curtain first. You never know who's watching or plotting. You're already a few steps deeper into the shadows now, deeper into the folds of gauze-draped palaces and heat-drenched temples. The scent has changed. There's myrrh in the air, but also something spicier, clove cinnamon, and something else. Power. You're in ancient Egypt, and it's more than just sand and sphinxes. This is where intimacy was cosmic choreography, and fertility a political performance with divine co-stars. You stroll past towering pillars painted in gold and lapis hieroglyphs, shimmering like secrets waiting to be touched. On the walls, gods and goddesses writhe in eternal embrace. You don't just believe sex was sacred here, you see it etched into stone over and over again. Pharaohs weren't just men, they were living gods. And gods didn't date. They united ritually, symbolically, and very, very publicly. Take the ancient ritual of the Heb-Sed festival, for example. Every 30 years or so, if the pharaoh could still jog a lap around a sacred courtyard and then prove his virility with a symbolic or actual act of fertility. Yep, right there in the temple, he'd secure his divine right to rule for another cycle. No pressure, right? But it wasn't just about keeping the throne. In Egyptian thought, fertility was the foundation of the universe. You see Isis piecing Osiris back together, except one part. You know which. That myth alone is enough to convince a whole civilization that rebirth and virility are inseparable. So when Pharaoh says he's the embodiment of Osiris, he means it. And the queen becomes Isis. Their union wasn't just steamy, it was statecraft. You move quietly through an antechamber where incense coils upward like a cobra. There's a young priestess preparing an offering of honey lotus and pomegranate seeds. She's not just feeding the gods, she's prepping for a fertility rite. These rituals weren't fringe, they were central. The idea that divine union ensured the flooding of the Nile, that's agricultural policy, wrapped in bed linen. Temple courtesans, often mistaken for mere sex workers by modern eyes, were closer to sacred intermediaries. They weren't just there to please. They were trained to channel divine energy through intimacy. They memorized chants, scented their bodies with exotic oils, and wore gowns so sheer you'd wonder if they were spun from morning mist. And then there's the fringe tidbit that always stirs debate: crocodile dung contraceptives. Yes, you heard that right. Historians discovered ancient scrolls describing how women would insert dried crocodile dung into themselves to prevent pregnancy. Was it ritual medicine or myth? Scholars still argue whether it was symbolic fertility control or just exceptionally bad gynecology. But it didn't stop with rituals and remedies. You slip through the back corridor of a palace and find yourself behind the royal bedchamber. This room isn't soft. Its stark, more political stage than private haven. This is where the queen, perhaps Nefertiti herself, might have summoned a servant with a single flick of her ringed finger. Not for a massage, for a message. Because in Egypt, intimacy was a chessboard. Marriages were contracts, and affection was optional. Cleopatra, yes, her would later weaponize intimacy like a seasoned diplomat. But even before her Egyptian queens knew how to wield allure like a scepter. It wasn't just about satisfying a ruler, it was about influencing him. You might imagine Cleopatra lounging with Antony or Julius Caesar draped in linen and wit. But even in her youth, she would have been trained in divine femininity, a royal curriculum mixing myth, linguistics, perfume, alchemy, and yes, seduction. Nothing was left to chance when your country's future could hang on a kiss. That said, not every union was glamorous. Some queens were sisters to their kings. Incest was state policy in Egypt. To keep the bloodline pure and the divine right, unchallenged siblings married, shared beds and sometimes tombs. Modern readers cringe, but in their cosmology, it was textbook divine order. Isis married Osiris after all. Why not them? Still not everyone agreed this made sense. You stumble on a papyrus tucked into a priest's archive, an unsigned complaint about unusual unions at court. Was it political slander, religious dissent? The fact that such things were written down at all tells you not everyone was drinking the lotus wine. And speaking of dissent, let's talk Akhenaten. The heretic pharaoh who abandoned the old gods and invented monotheism, kind of. He and Queen Nefertiti presented themselves not as distant gods, but as tender lovers. They kissed in public, played with their children in art, and held hands unheard of in royal Egyptian imagery. Were they revolutionary lovers, or just savvy propagandists? Historians still debate whether their public affection was authentic or strategic branding for a political coup. Either way, it disrupted the system. When Tutankhamun came along, yes, the boy king, you can almost hear the palace walls sigh in relief. Back to the old gods, back to the old ways, back to bedchambers where love stayed behind curtains and rituals ruled the night. You leave the chamber now, your sandals silent against the polished stone. You pass a carved relief of Hathor, goddess of music, love, and joy, her breasts bare, her smile eternal. Even she reminds you intimacy in ancient Egypt wasn't about emotion. It was about order, legacy, fertility, and control. It's funny, isn't it? For a culture obsessed with death, they sure spent a lot of energy making life. You're deeper now, down in the layers where reeds rise from muddy riverbeds, where ziggurats cast long shadows over the Euphrates, and where pleasure was often mistaken for prophecy. You're in Babylon, ancient Mesopotamia. The cradle of civilization, sure, but also the cradle of some of the most calculated, scandal-soaked courtship rituals ever etched into clay. The city hums beneath you, all burnt brick and copper sky. You hear the faint clang of bronze and the sizzle of something roasted, but you're not here for street food. You're here for what happened behind temple walls, where sacred sex and political deals shared the same pillow. Picture this, a high priestess, eyes lined with charcoal fingers, fragrant with frankincense, standing beneath a canopy of embroidered linen. A king kneels before her, not for forgiveness, but for favor. This isn't just worship, it's politics via pillow talk. You've stumbled into one of the most debated rituals of the ancient world, the hieros gamos, or sacred marriage rite. Once a year, as part of the New Year festival in cities like Uruk or Babylon, the king was expected to consummate a ceremonial union with a priestess of Inanna or Ishtar, depending on the century. The result, a divine blessing on the land. Rainfall, fertility, and an entire year of not being murdered by your rivals. No pressure. Now historians still argue whether this ritual was literal or symbolic. Was it an actual night of sanctioned sex, or just incense-heavy theater for an audience of hopeful farmers and nervous nobles? Fringe theories insist there were temple chambers made specifically for it, complete with perfumed silks and discreet flutists. Others say it was pantomime, a kind of erotic fanfic with official state approval. You pad barefoot through a ruined palace corridor, bricks still warm from the day's heat. On one wall, a faded relief shows a queen with 3 attendants, 2 fanning her, 1 adjusting her hair. She's preparing not for war or debate, but for an appearance at the temple. She'll offer gifts, maybe prayers, maybe more. Because here's the thing, sex in Mesopotamia wasn't dirty, it was divine. Intimacy was a way to align with the cosmic order. You don't blush at the mention of it here, you bow your head. Temple courtesans, sometimes called ishtaritams, were not just prostitutes. They were sacred instruments. Their rituals weren't transactional, they were transformational. Being chosen by one of them was said to grant favor from Inanna herself. A fringe scroll claims a king once postponed war because his favorite Ishtaritam had a dream involving a dove, a broken vase, and a line of ants. Who needs strategy when you've got divine metaphors? But beyond the temples, intimacy was still a tool, especially in royal homes. Royal marriages were less about compatibility and more about credibility. A union between 2 dynasties meant fewer rebellions, smoother trade routes, and hopefully heirs that didn't try to strangle their siblings by age 10. You peek into one of these royal bedrooms, a space no larger than a merchant's pantry. Woven mats, a bronze mirror, and a single delicate perfume burner. That's it. No velvet drapes, no erotic murals. Because in Mesopotamia, even seduction could be humble, as long as the result was effective. Some queens wielded their influence in bed, others through their offspring. One Akkadian queen, a fierce matron named Tashlultum, was rumored to have orchestrated a coup from inside the harem by ensuring all her rivals mysteriously fell ill after sharing the king's soup. Historians suspect poison. We suspect excellent timing. And then there's the curious case of marriage markets. Herodotus claimed Babylonian girls were auctioned annually, with the most attractive fetching high prices to fund dowries for the less desired. Whether this was real or just Greek gossip remains murky. Scholars still debate whether these events were empowering, exploitative, or completely misinterpreted by a nosy traveler with a flair for exaggeration. But one thing's certain, women in royal circles learned early that their bodies were currencies. Some traded for titles, others for temporary safety. And a few, like the mysterious Queen Shibtu of Mari, used their bedroom as a war room. Letters between her and her husband, King Zimri Lim, reveal a surprisingly equal partnership. She gave him military advice. He gave her affection. She ruled in his absence. He sent her baskets of dates and unusually detailed updates on troop movements. A little sweet, a little strategic. Even the laws reflected this dynamic. The Code of Hammurabi, etched on black basalt for all to see, had plenty to say about marriage adultery and who got what when the love or usefulness dried up. If a woman couldn't produce children, divorce. If she entered another man's house without permission, punishment by drowning. Gentle, it was not. But predictable, absolutely. Still, the human side seeps through. A faded tablet found near modern-day Syria shows a husband writing to his wife from battle. He misses her laughter. He asks if the fig tree has bloomed yet. He wonders if the neighbors are gossiping again. In a world of contracts and conquest, it's a whisper of real affection. You step out of that dusty chamber and into moonlight. The city is quieter now, but not still. Somewhere nearby, a woman lights oil in her lamp, tucks a note under her sash, and heads toward the palace. Not a lover, not a wife. A messenger of something far older than paperwork. She walks with the calm certainty of someone who knows the bed she'll enter tonight might shift the future of the empire. In Babylon, intimacy wasn't about candlelight or cuddles. It was about control, softly spoken, seldom forgotten. You wake to the scrape of sandals on stone and the rustle of linen against flesh. You're in the ancient lands of the Hittites now, where love is wrapped in treaties, betrayal is soaked in rosewater, and royal harems hum quietly behind the limestone walls. This isn't Babylon's incense-soaked theater or Egypt's ritual fertility festival. This is Anatolia, where queens don't just seduce, they negotiate. You pass through thick stone corridors, cold despite the summer heat outside. The air inside smells like pressed olives and burnt cedar. You're entering the queen's wing, and tonight she's not brushing her hair or waiting demurely by a brazier. She's plotting. That smile, it's strategic. In the Hittite Empire, sprawling across what's now Turkey, royal women weren't ornamental. They were powerful, literate, and politically lethal when needed. The queen bore the title Tawanana, and once she earned it, she kept it for life even after her husband died, which, as you can imagine, made for some very awkward stepmother versus new wife situations. You tiptoe past an open door and catch sight of the Tawanana writing. She doesn't dictate, she inscribes. Hittite queens could read and compose cuneiform letters themselves, and many of their messages survive. Some concern tribute. Some are marriage negotiations. A few are chillingly passive-aggressive reminders to rival queens that, oh yes, she still holds the ritual rights to the spring festival. The shade is real even in baked clay. And this is where the bedroom politics take a turn. Because while the king had concubines, dozens, even hundreds, the queen wasn't just a figurehead. She was high priestess too. Which means that during religious festivals, she shared a sacred bond with the gods, and by extension, a binding influence over the king himself. It's like being both a first lady and the archbishop, with excellent robes. But life in the harem, not quite so divine. You peek into one of the inner courtyards. It's serene until you look closer. Concubines walk silently between rooms, some barely more than girls. Each one was chosen, gifted, or demanded as part of a diplomatic agreement. These women are not here by romantic whim, they are human treaties, living parchment, and they know it. You catch the eye of one woman kneeling to light a small oil lamp. She lowers her gaze slowly, but there's no shyness in it, just calculation. Maybe she's from Mitanni or Kidzuwatna. A princess traded for border peace. Her jewelry is delicate, but her ambition is sharp enough to cut stone. Fringe Hittite texts suggest some concubines kept coded diaries scratched into the clay in private shorthand. They recorded their rivalries, their alliances, even their moments with the king. Historians still argue whether these accounts were meant as future blackmail or just a very dangerous kind of therapy. And what of love? Did any of it feel real? That's where it gets murky. A series of unearthed tablets from Hattusa includes prayers by women asking the storm god, Tar hunt for affection, not protection, not health, but love. Genuine, swoony, complicating love. Whether they received it is unclear, but it does suggest that beneath the layers of protocol and perfume, hearts still beat a little recklessly. Now here's a curiosity. The Hittites had a law forbidding bestiality and another outlawing sibling marriage, but no clear ban on a queen arranging for her rivals to be transferred or simply disappeared. Power didn't whisper here. It pinned you down with a stare and handed you a fig as a veiled threat. You wander into the remnants of a royal garden, overgrown now, but once trimmed in straight lines. This was where the king might meet a concubine beneath moonlight, not because he loved her, but because she bore a son. The boys born of such unions were half royal, half pawn. If the queen had no sons, these boys became succession threats or political scapegoats. Many were sent away to become governors in dusty provinces. Some simply vanished. But not all endings were tragic. Some women rose. One legendary figure only known by a single glyph, meaning sister star, was said to have been a low-ranked concubine who rose to rule as regent after a failed assassination left the king incapacitated. Her brief rule ended in scandal, of course, but her story echoes like perfume in an empty room, haunting, sweet and dangerous to inhale too deeply. You take a last look at the royal chamber. The bed is low and carved with lions. Above it hangs a wooden frame draped in dyed linen red and indigo, the colors of fertility and wisdom. It's here that treaties were sealed, heirs conceived, and loyalties tested. The mattress is stuffed with reeds and whispers. And don't forget the eunuchs. They're in the background again, always. Trusted to guard the harem, serve the queen, and report back to the king. Or perhaps vice versa. One text from a palace steward describes a eunuch who passed messages between three rival lovers, each believing they were the king's favorite. Honestly, that eunuch probably deserved a raise. So you leave this place, this intricate mesh of seduction, survival, and sacred duty, with one clear takeaway in the Hittite world. A soft voice could carry more power than 1,000 soldiers, if you knew how to use it. And if you wore the crown, even better if you also held the key to the bedroom. Now you're crossing into the lands where the wind carries prayers and inheritance scrolls, where the laws of love are etched not into passion, but parchment. Welcome to ancient Israel. And tonight your feet are bare on sun-warmed stone, standing just outside a modest house where a man unrolls a document by candlelight, not a romantic poem, but a ketubah. That's right. You're about to witness one of history's most structured approaches to intimacy. Here, love lives inside contracts. You can almost hear the rustle of papyrus as dowry details are read aloud. The groom's obligations, housing, clothing, and conjugal rights. 3 things, not one more, not one less. He promises in writing that he'll satisfy her not just emotionally, but physically. And yes, that's enforceable. In ancient Israelite culture, intimacy isn't hidden behind temple curtains or scented silks. It's regulated, it's sacred, but it's also utterly magnificently bureaucratic. The ketubah wasn't just a symbolic keepsake, it was legal insurance. If the marriage failed, the wife had rights to financial restitution to her property, even to protection if her husband went wandering off with a Philistine flute girl. Not exactly romantic, but in an age where women were often traded like barley, this counted as progressive. And while we're here, let's peek inside the house next door. That's not a honeymoon suite, it's a bride's week chamber. After a wedding, the couple was expected to spend 7 days in semi-seclusion, consummating the marriage and receiving visits from friends bringing food and extremely nosy advice. Curtains flutter. Jokes are told, and occasionally a blood-stained cloth is hung outside as evidence. Yes, that kind of evidence. Welcome to ancient community pressure in its most literal form. But don't let the practicality fool you. There's romance here too, just hidden under layers of duty. The Song of Songs buried in the Hebrew Bible reads like it was written by someone who definitely snuck out after curfew. Your navel is a rounded goblet, it says. Your neck is like the Tower of David. Flirty, maybe. Historically confusing, absolutely, but undeniably passionate. You find yourself in a courtyard now where an older couple sits by a fig tree. He offers her a slice with honey. They laugh. This isn't lust. This is longevity. In Hebrew tradition, intimacy was meant to endure not just as desire, but as covenant. Physical closeness was a duty and a mitzvah, a good deed. On Friday nights, it was even considered spiritually ideal. Shabbat wasn't just for rest, if you catch my drift. Still, things weren't so idyllic for everyone. Polygamy existed, especially for kings. You glance toward a distant palace and spot shadows of Solomon and his infamous 700 wives and 300 concubines. Most of them were political tokens, daughters of foreign rulers sent with camel trains and almond cakes. Scholars still debate whether this was excessive diplomacy or just really bad time management. And then there's King David. You remember him, shepherd, slingshot enthusiast, part-time harpist. His affair with Bathsheba is one of history's most infamous entanglements. He saw her bathing on a rooftop and just couldn't help himself. He summoned her, got her pregnant, then arranged for her husband to be accidentally killed in battle. You wince. Not your most charming move, David. But Bathsheba, she survives and thrives. She ends up Queen Mother, and her son Solomon inherits the throne. Fringe theory. Some believe Bathsheba manipulated her way to power, playing the long game after being wronged. Historians still argue whether she was a passive victim or a political mastermind in a linen robe. Back in the village, the local shofet, a kind of community judge, handles a delicate case. A husband claims his wife isn't meeting expectations. She argues he's working too late in the vineyards. The elders listen. Eyebrows are raised. You'd think they were debating tax codes, but no, this is about affection frequency and fairness. And sometimes she wins. Odd, right, that a woman in a patriarchal system could take her husband to court over lack of intimacy and get support, but it happened. Because in this world, affection was obligation. Desire wasn't just expected, it was scheduled. Literally. Talmudic scholars laid out a marital timetable: laborers once a week, sailors every 6 months. That's right. There was a frequency chart. You almost admire the brutal efficiency, and yet love crept through. One scroll from Qumran, possibly written by an insane monk, describes a forbidden affection between a scribe and a widow. He praises her mind before her beauty. He dreams of her not in lust, but in longing. Nothing ever came of it. But the ache in the parchment is real. You're stepping through twilight now, down a narrow alley, where olive oil lamps flicker against mud brick walls. A bride leans from a window. Her veil flutters. A figure waves from below, then disappears into the dusk. Was it her husband, a lover? A merchant who gave her too many figs? The story doesn't say. Because in ancient Israel, intimacy lived in the spaces between structure. In law scrolls, yes, but also in poetry, in longing glances, in the shared bread of a Friday night meal. So while passion here may wear a cloak of modesty and legality, don't be fooled. Behind that marriage contract lies a world where touch is sacred, absence is noticed, and love, quiet, steady, resilient, often finds a way. You step across an arid plain, shimmering under a copper sun, and in the distance something gleams, domes, gardens, long corridors of cool shade. You've arrived in ancient Persia, in the heart of the Achaemenid Empire. Don't let the serenity fool you. Behind these mosaic walls, you're about to enter a world where intimacy is as calculated as any military campaign. Welcome to the realm of Persian pillow politics. You glide past columns so tall, they seem to prop up the sky through a royal palace where stone lions guard entrances and soft-spoken servants slide along marble floors like ghosts. You're headed toward the harem, but not the cartoon fantasy version. This is not all perfumed feathers and giggles behind curtains. It's more like a bureaucratic machine disguised as a spa. The royal harem of Persia was immense. Not just in population, sometimes hundreds of women, but in purpose. Each woman wasn't merely here for pleasure. She was part of an empire-wide strategy. The Achaemenid kings accepted wives and concubines from across their sprawling territories: Bactria, Lydia, Sogdia, even Egypt. Each woman brought political peace with her bridal silk. But once inside, the games began. You pass through the outer courtyard, where younger women are learning court etiquette from older matrons. They're taught languages, poetry, cosmetics, and most crucially, how to maneuver social ladders that are slipperier than oiled mosaics. And the queen, she ruled this world. Take Queen Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great. You watch her glide past in a linen veil so sheer it might as well be made of authority. Not only did she marry 2 kings, including Darius the Great, but she bore Xerxes, that guy who later tried to invade Greece with some very dramatic bridges. Some say Atossa whispered strategies in his ear. Others claim she manipulated which concubines got time with the king to steer court alliances. Historians still debate whether she ruled behind the scenes or just mastered appearing to. But what's clear, when Atossa spoke, heads turned. The harem had strict tiers. At the top were noble wives, usually of royal blood. Then came lesser wives and concubines, some born into wealth, others gifted to the king. At the bottom were attendants, sometimes the king's daughters from lesser unions. Yes, you read that right, trained to serve their half-brothers and uncles. Empires can be messy. You're escorted into the inner chambers where the scent of rosewater, myrrh, and maybe mild dread floats in the air. This is where intimacy happens, but also betrayal. Because what happens when every woman in the palace is competing to bear the next heir? One fringe tale tells of a concubine from Susa, who upon learning she was pregnant, bribed a different concubine was expecting instead. The result, a misplaced poisoning, a quietly shuffled funeral, and one very smug mother-to-be. The child would later be paraded through the palace as a divine sign. The eunuch, rewarded handsomely and mysteriously, transferred to a remote province soon after. Coincidence not likely. In Persia, where silence was policy and smiles could be sharpened into daggers, intimacy came with its own paperwork. Yes, actual documentation. Some concubines were given land or titles upon pregnancy, but only if the king acknowledged paternity. And if he didn't, that swelling belly became a liability, not a blessing. You pass a silk partition into the king's private chamber. The mattress is high and stuffed with down the sheets embroidered with lions and stars. It's said the king selected his companion for the night by tossing an apple, a gold one. Subtle no tonight. A girl from media holds the fruit in her lap. She pretends to look shy, but her coal-lined eyes are measuring every servant in the room. If she plays this right, her brothers might be promoted. Her uncle might avoid taxes. Her father might keep his head. Persian kings had so many consorts that they were assigned numbers. Imagine being known as concubine 84, but dreaming of being wife number 3. Advancement was rare, but not impossible. Birth of a son helped. A well-timed favor did too. And sometimes a love letter slipped into a robe pocket just before the king's morning bath. Love letters, oh yes, they existed. One scrap written in Old Persian and barely surviving the centuries reads, "I dreamt I wore your cloak and rode your horse through the garden. It smelled of almonds." Historians argue whether this was poetic flirtation or literal property theft. Either way, it's oddly romantic. Not everything was roses and rapture, though. Eunuchs were tasked with ensuring order among the harem women. They could discipline, isolate, and occasionally disappear someone quietly. One fringe document from Persepolis includes a list of missing concubines after a queen's death. 17 names, no explanations. Theories range from suicide to exile to forced silence. And speaking of silence, Persian intimacy had a deep connection to divinity. Zoroastrian influence, especially during the Achaemenid period, framed bodily union as a sacred act, but only within righteous bounds. Too much indulgence was frowned upon. Improper unions were spiritually polluting. Of course, no one expected the king to live like a monk, but he was encouraged to choose his partners wisely, or at least discreetly. That's probably why secret tunnels existed. You follow one now narrow, dusty, hidden behind a decorative screen. It connects the king's chamber to a quieter harem annex. This isn't about escape, it's about options. The king could visit someone without raising eyebrows, or he could leave without waking her. Either way, plausible deniability was built into the architecture. You emerge into a moonlit balcony overlooking a vast courtyard where cypress trees line reflecting pools. Somewhere below, women sing softly in a language you don't understand, but the tone, pure longing. One royal chronicler in a scroll later found near Pasargadae describes a night when the king called no one and the queen lit every lamp. No names, just shadows. Suggesting perhaps that even in an empire built on structure and symmetry, desire sometimes broke protocol. So you stand there under Persian stars and feel the weight of every secret whispered on these balconies. Every ambition born under sheer canopies. Every affection forced or fleeting that tilted the balance of the empire, even if just by a thread. In the end, the Achaemenid court was less a den of desire than a spreadsheet wrapped in silk. Yet beneath the rows and columns of alliances, dowries, and designations, there beat very human hearts, nervous, clever, hopeful. And whether you were a queen, a concubine, or just a girl who caught a golden apple, your fate was written not just in ink or blood, but in the delicate calculus of who warmed the king's bed and why. By the time you find yourself reclining on a pile of embroidered cushions, goblet in hand, a breeze drifting in from the Aegean, you know this isn't going to be a typical dinner party. Welcome to the Greek symposium, a word that translates more or less to drink together. But don't let the simplicity fool you. You're about to attend a carefully choreographed explosion of wine-wit politics and very unfiltered intimacy. You glance around the room. The walls are painted with scenes from myth Heracles wrestling Amazon's Aphrodite rising from the sea, a suspicious number of centaurs getting frisky. The air smells like roasted lamb and sweet resin from the crater of diluted wine, always diluted, because only barbarians drink it straight. And yes, you're reclining. That's how this works. Everyone's stretched out on couches in their best chitons, sipping slowly, while musicians play aulos flutes and kitharas in the background. You're not here just to drink. You're here to bond, to philosophize, to flirt. Maybe all at once. Women, they're here too, but not the wives. The wives are at home managing the household and praying you don't come back with an unexpected baby from someone else. No, the women here are hetairai, educated courtesans, musicians, dancers, trained in conversation, art, politics, and the erotic arts. Think of them as high society influencers who read Homer and could out-debate a senator. Some were enslaved, yes, but others were wealthy in their own right. One even reportedly bought her freedom and opened her own school. Boss Moves Ancient Edition. And then, of course, there's the boys. Yep. Welcome to the very particular and controversial institution of pederasty. Older men, the Erasts, often mentored teenage boys, the Eromenos, with the ideal being a bond that was intellectual, moral, and yes, often sexual. Scholars still debate whether these relationships were affectionate mentorships, exploitative power plays, or both. Some texts idealize it. Others warn against imbalance. It's complicated and unsettling by modern standards. You overhear Socrates in a corner challenging a young man on the nature of desire. Not in theory, in practice. His tone is playful, but the subtext, dense. Philosophers at these symposia used seduction as pedagogy. A compliment on beauty might be a segue into ethics. A playful touch, a metaphor about the soul. Either that or just a playful touch. You watch as a hetaira named Thais balances a kylix on her head while quoting Sappho. She smiles like a cat with a secret. And maybe she is one. Because in this space, intimacy is a performance art. Every glance is a negotiation. Every toast, a dare. In one fringe story, a particularly charismatic flute girl was said to have seduced not one, but two Athenian generals during a single symposium. When confronted, she simply shrugged and said their strategies were equally unconvincing. Ice cold. You kind of love her. But not all was poetry and play. There were rules and hierarchy. Only elite men could host symposia, and guests were carefully chosen. You could climb the social ladder with the right story, or fall off it entirely if you got too drunk and said something scandalous, like questioning Pericles' haircut or hinting a philosopher's student was a better kisser. One mainstream historical moment, the symposium written by Plato. It's not just a dialogue, it's a party. The guests take turns praising Eros, the god of love. The speeches range from the poetic to the very, very awkward. Aristophanes tells a story about humans once being round creatures split in two by the gods. That's why we seek our other halves. Cute, right? Until you realize he's implying everyone's stumbling around, trying to reassemble their cosmic meatball. Alcibiades, oh Alcibiades, bursts in drunk and half-naked ranting about how Socrates seduced him and then refused to sleep with him. Scandalous. Historians still debate whether this was performance revenge or a weird combination of both. You step away from the cushions and wander outside into the garden where vines climb trellises under the stars. A young Eromenos leans against a pillar, cheeks flushed from too much wine and too much attention. He's watching his Erastes, who's busy debating the nature of justice with a guest. You wonder if the boy wishes the conversation would turn to him again, or if he's relieved it hasn't. Because behind all the poetry, symposium culture could be isolating. If you aged out of desirability, you faded. If you said the wrong thing, you vanished from invitations. If you got too attached, that was your own foolishness. The intimacy here was intellectual, yes, but also transactional. Reputation mattered more than affection. One scholar suggests the Greeks weren't obsessed with love so much as they were obsessed with status through love. Every relationship, every flirtation, every shared fig or whispered quote It was part of a social currency exchange. Affection might be real, but it was rarely free. Still, something tender lingers. A shard of pottery discovered in a symposium site near Thebes carries a scratched inscription. You looked at me. I forgot to breathe. That's not philosophy. That's a pulse. So you finish your wine, stretch your legs, and let the laughter of the symposium fade behind you. Tonight's love wasn't eternal, but it was clever, lyrical, and just intoxicated enough to feel real. And tomorrow, it might be remembered as a poem or a punchline. You duck beneath the eaves of a stone house, now slipping into the chill of early morning in Sparta. The silence is heavy, not with sleep, but with restraint. This isn't Athens, all laughter and symposiums. In Sparta, intimacy wears armor, and it doesn't speak unless it has to. You crouch in a low-ceilinged room, barely lit, where a woman sits upright on a stiff wooden stool, braiding her hair in practiced silence. Her wedding dress, not lace, not silk. It's a man's cloak. That's right. You're about to witness one of the most cryptic, least romantic, and somehow most intimate marital traditions in the ancient world. When Spartans married, the bride had her head shaved. She dressed in a man's tunic and sandals, and then wait for it. She was hidden in a dark room. Her new husband, he had to sneak in under cover of night. They'd meet in secrecy, no feasts, no guests, just darkness, rustling linen, and the quiet collision of duty and desire. Then he left, back to the barracks. Because in Sparta, even after marriage, men lived with their fellow soldiers. They trained. They fought. They slept beside shields, not wives. You'd think this would be frustrating, but for the Spartans, intimacy wasn't about emotional bonding, it was about reproduction, duty over delight. Yet something strange happened. All this secrecy, it made the longing worse, more tender. Imagine only seeing your spouse in snatched midnight moments, barely speaking, learning the shape of their breath, before you ever learned their laugh. Forbidden fruit, but legal. That hits different. You trace the path of a Spartan groom, now sneaking from the agoge, the brutal military training grounds, to his wife's hidden chamber. It's quiet, no perfume, no candles, just the scrape of calloused fingers across skin and the whisper of a promise, not love necessarily, but legacy. Because producing strong Spartan children wasn't just encouraged, it was expected. If a couple failed, the elders noticed, and sometimes intervened. One Spartan law allowed a husband to lend his wife to a stronger man for procreation. Yes, really. And no, nobody asked the wife what she thought. You imagine the world's most awkward handshake. Fringe accounts even suggest older men were expected to mentor younger grooms, offering advice, or in some unsettling cases, practical demonstrations. Scholars still argue whether these were literal events or metaphorical teachings twisted over time. Either way, intimacy here was a team sport, and not always by choice. Women, though, don't mistake them for submissive. Spartan women were fierce. They exercised, publicly wrestled, raced, and showed more skin than any other women in the Greek world. They were trained to be healthy, strong, and sarcastic. One famous Spartan mother told her son, "Come back with your shield or on it." A modern Spartan wife might say, "Come back," and remember to sneak in quietly. A mainstream historical fact. Spartan women had unusual rights. They could own property, inherit wealth, and divorce their husbands. A woman named Gorgo, wife of King Leonidas, is remembered for her political savvy and razor wit. When an Athenian woman once asked, "Why are you Spartan women the only ones who rule your men?" Gorgo reportedly replied, "Because we are the only women who give birth to men." Mic drop. Ancient style. But not everything was so noble. You eavesdrop near the edge of a bathhouse, where two girls whisper behind a pillar. One confides that her husband hasn't visited in weeks. Another says she's been lent to a man who smells like goats and ambition. There's sympathy and a little envy. Because affection in Sparta was rare and irregular, and affection that came with respect rarer still. And yet bonds formed, slowly, quietly, through repetition, through shared rituals. Some couples developed a deep tenderness forged through years of these stolen nights. A fragment of a poem by Alcman, a Spartan lyricist, hints at this. Her voice is a string I pluck in my chest. Not heard by others, but known by me. You walk now through a field outside the city where older couples tend grapevines. They don't hold hands. They don't kiss. But their silence isn't cold, it's weathered, comfortable. You begin to understand Spartan intimacy isn't loud or lyrical. It's steady. It doesn't declare itself. It just stays. One fringe tale tells of a soldier who, injured in battle, refused to die until he could see his wife. His comrades carried him by nightfall to her chamber. He died with her hand on his face. The gesture wasn't romantic by our standards. No poetry, no last words. Just touch. But in Sparta, that was everything. So as you slip back into the city, the torches along the roads guttering low, you realize something unexpected. Secrecy didn't weaken intimacy here. It intensified it. Like a coal burning slowly under pressure. No fanfare, just fire. In the dark, a figure moves quietly across the roofline. A young groom on his way to the same hidden chamber he snuck into for weeks, maybe years. You wonder what words he'll say, if any. Probably none. But then again, in Sparta, a hand reaching through the dark says more than 1,000 verses ever could. The sun climbs higher now as you drift southeast past the silent olive groves and stern temples of Sparta into the clamor and contradiction of Athens. Here the streets bustle with philosophy and fishmongers, where artists praise democracy by day, then whisper to mistresses by lamplight. Athens loves to talk about virtue, but behind its polished columns, it's messier, and you're about to see exactly why. You pass a courtyard where a woman peers from a lattice window, half hidden in shadow. That's not a stylistic choice, it's the law. Athenian wives were expected to stay inside, out of sight, out of mind, and if the husband had his way, out of trouble. You're entering a world where women are separated by architecture, by status, and by strategy. The Athenian marriage wasn't a love story. It was a property transfer. Wives were expected to bear children, manage the household, and stay invisible. Their names weren't even used in public. They were referred to as the mother of my children or my housekeeper. Romance. Not part of the job description, so where did affection go? You turn a corner into a dim alleyway behind a wine shop and suddenly it's everywhere. In the arms of courtesans, in the songs of hired flute girls, in the honey-dripped letters delivered at midnight. In Athens, love didn't live in the home. It lived outside of it. The Hetairai again here, even more influential. These women were educated, witty, often multilingual, and capable of sparring with philosophers. Some hosted their own salons, mingling with playwrights, generals, and orators. Aspasia, the most famous among them, was partner to Pericles himself, the man who rebuilt Athens. She advised him on speeches and statecraft. Some say she wrote parts of his public addresses. Others say she simply inspired them with her intellect and her lap. Meanwhile, the wives. They lived in the gynaikonitis, the women's quarters, rarely crossing into the male spaces of the house. They weren't supposed to dine with guests. They weren't supposed to leave unaccompanied. Their job was to maintain the oikos, the household economy. And if the husband strayed, that was expected. But if she did, different story. You step into the agora, the Athenian marketplace, and see a crowd gathering. A trial is underway. A man accuses another of seducing his wife. Under Athenian law, adultery wasn't just a private betrayal, it was a crime. Not because of jealousy, but because it could compromise the family line. A man could murder his wife's lover on the spot and face no punishment. But if she'd been raped, that was less severe. Because rape, oddly, wasn't seen as corrupting her loyalty. Choice was more dangerous than violence. Historians still argue whether Athenian men feared female sexuality or just couldn't control it. Fringe theories claim that some wives feigned illness just to escape the house under a physician's order, only to meet lovers at the healer's practice. One papyrus letter full of flowery metaphors ends with a code phrase, "I await the herbs at dusk," which honestly sounds a lot like ancient Tinder. And then there were the porneia brothels licensed by the state. Yes, you heard that right. Athens taxed sex work, not out of morality, but out of revenue. A brothel called the House of Pisistratos was rumored to make more than some olive groves. You pass by its remains, now nothing but stone slabs and graffiti, etched into the floor names hearts and what might be price lists. Capitalism meet carnality. But beneath all this structure and suppression, intimacy slipped through the cracks. A man named Eubulos wrote a comedy where a husband, frustrated with his wife's silence, dresses as a servant to sneak into her room and listen to her secret songs. He learns that she longs not for freedom but for kindness. It's played for laughs. But the truth lands harder. You find a faded mural in a bathhouse near the Piraeus port, two figures in silhouette reclining under an arbor. Not heterae, not nobles, just two people, equal, relaxed, maybe in love, or maybe just enjoying each other without titles. It's rare in Athenian art, but it's there. You hear the rhythm of Athenian contradiction in every step now. The city that gave us Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle also gave us laws where a man could exile his wife for drinking wine, where a father could betroth his 10-year-old daughter for a political alliance, where intimacy was often kept secret, not because it was shameful, but because it was precious. Yet Athenians loved to talk about love. They philosophized it, dramatized it, wrote plays about it. Euripides' Medea tells of a woman betrayed by her husband and exacting revenge not just on him, but on their children. An extreme reaction. Sure, but it reveals something even in a world where wives were silenced, their pain echoed. You walk past a small altar to Aphrodite. Flowers wilt on its base. A young man kneels to leave an offering, 2 figs and a scrap of poetry. His fingers linger on the stone. Maybe he's thinking of a courtesan he can't afford. Maybe of a wife he barely knows. Intimacy in Athens didn't live where it was supposed to. It seeped out of the institutions, pooled in the corners, bloomed in forbidden places. Behind the rules, the hierarchies, the economic transactions, there pulsed a stubborn longing for recognition, for tenderness, for something that felt like choice. And so, as you turn down another marble corridor, sandals tapping quietly, you understand in Athens love wasn't absent. It was just misplaced. Scattered in whispers pressed into poems and hidden behind latticed windows waiting to be noticed. You step now into a villa where the marble floors are cool and the laughter is louder. The air smells like citrus, wine, and ambition. Welcome to Rome, empire of emperors, engineers, and exquisitely entangled erotics. Here, power and pleasure aren't opposites, they're siblings. Occasionally lovers, often both. Rome doesn't pretend intimacy is sacred. It makes it a sport. You stroll past open atriums where mosaic floors depict wild orgies, not as scandal, but as status. If your dinner party didn't include at least a suggestive mural, were you even trying? But let's start at the top. Because when your emperor is Augustus, you don't just gossip about sex, you legislate it. You see, Augustus was obsessed with morality, in a very Roman way. He passed laws punishing adultery, even exiling his own daughter Julia for being a little too social. Never mind that he probably winked at his own affairs while signing the bill. The Senate applauded. The poets groaned, and Julia banished to an island. No men, no wine, no visitors. Just her and some very judgmental seagulls. Meanwhile, behind his back, Rome was thriving in sin. You head toward a wealthy home in the Suburra district, Rome's beating, buzzing underbelly. Here, intimacy is currency. Mistresses aren't hidden, they're paraded. You hear one shouting from a balcony, threatening to break a lyre over her lover's head. She's dramatic, she's dangerous, she's adored. Romans loved gossip. It was practically a civic duty. Everyone knew who was sleeping with whom and what bribes changed hands to make it happen. One senator's wife was rumored to let gladiators in through the kitchen entrance. Another supposedly kept a slave dressed as Mars and summoned him during thunderstorms. Historical fact, maybe not, but believable entirely. And then there's Messalina, Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius. A woman whose libido is still whispered about by historians with both awe and horror. Tacitus wrote that she disguised herself at night and worked in a brothel just for the thrill. Was it true fringe theory? Sure. But the point was clear: Roman women, when powerful, scared people, especially in bed. But Roman men, they had options. Wives, yes, but also slaves, boys, courtesans, poets, and anyone they could claim as inferior. Consent wasn't exactly a top concern. Legally, a male Roman citizen could do as he pleased with his household as long as he didn't dishonor another citizen's wife or daughter. Everyone else fair game. Still, there were rules. Well, social ones. You could sleep with a lower-class partner, but you'd better not fall in love. That was weak. That was Greek. Real Roman men didn't lose their heads or their hearts. Except when they did. One love poem by Catullus, written to a woman he calls Lesbia, drips with lust, sarcasm, and obsession. Give me 1,000 kisses, then 100 more. Sounds sweet, right? Until you read the next line where he curses her for being unfaithful. Love in Rome was volatile, like politics, like wine left out too long. And speaking of politics, the emperor's bed wasn't just for pleasure, it was a stage. You walk into a palace chamber now, and the furniture is sparse. Just a low couch, a few statues of Venus and Mars, and a carefully placed curtain. A messenger waits outside, pretending not to listen. Because who the emperor invites in each night could mean a promotion or a poisoning. Caligula, infamous for his excess, reportedly held public rehearsals of intimacy with his sisters. Claudius married his niece. Nero castrated a male slave, married him, and then paraded him as empress. Historians still argue whether these stories were exaggerated slander or uncomfortable truth. But either way, they weren't exactly surprising. Even marriages were tactical. A senator might marry a woman for her lineage, then ignore her completely. Or worse, publicly shame her for adultery after decades of his own. You pass a courtyard where a wife is being formally divorced for unseemly laughter. The real reason her dowry wasn't producing political dividends anymore. And yet somehow real affection still bloomed in these cracks. A tombstone inscription found near the Appian Way reads, "To my wife, who never ceased to be my friend." No grand titles, no accusations. Just that. It hits you harder than all of Rome's theatrical scandals combined. Not all Roman couples were miserable contracts. Some were partnerships. You catch sight of a husband and wife debating the best wine for dinner, laughing, holding hands. It's brief, but real. Then there were the lupanaria, the brothels. licensed, marked with carved phalluses leading the way like a treasure map. You enter one now, walls covered in graffiti. Felix was here. Marcia likes it rough. I paid 1 denarius and it was worth it. You learn a lot about Romans from their bathroom scrawl. But the most telling sign, a quote scratched in shaky Latin, "I kissed her and forgot my debts." Same, buddy. Same. You head toward the baths, now the great equalizers. Senators and slaves stripped together, gossiped together, occasionally got a little too comfortable together. Some bathhouses had private rooms. Others had enthusiastic blind spots. You pass a pair of sandals sitting a little too close together and decide not to ask questions. So what was Roman intimacy really? Loud, opportunistic, brutal at times, but also full of humanity. They didn't idealize it like the Greeks. They didn't sanctify it like the Egyptians. They just did it messily, dramatically, and very, very publicly. And now, as the sun sets over tiled rooftops and the wine amphorae are passed around again, you realize in Rome love might not be loyal, but it's unforgettable. Like an insult shouted from a balcony, or a kiss stolen in a shadowed courtyard. Just don't expect a happy ending. Expect an interesting one. The torches burn lower now as you sail across the midnight waves toward Alexandria, a city that smells like salt ink and ambition. Here, intimacy isn't just private, it's weaponized. You drift past tall marble columns and flowering courtyards into the domain of the queen, whose name alone still makes historians raise an eyebrow and adjust their collar, Cleopatra. You land softly, carried ashore on silk sandals and suspicion. The air is thick with jasmine and cedarwood, and somewhere beneath it all, a quieter scent strategy. You're in the royal palace, but you're not in the throne room. You're being led through a corridor that bends like a serpent, ending in an antechamber hung with gauze so thin it flutters with every breath. And tonight, you're about to see diplomacy in its most delicate form, seduction. Cleopatra VII, then, last pharaoh of Egypt, descendant of Ptolemy's speaker of 9 languages, lover of 2 Roman giants, and master of intimate statecraft. You hear her laugh before you see her. It's low, controlled, designed. She doesn't enter conversations, she orchestrates them. Forget the modern Hollywood gloss. Cleopatra wasn't just beautiful. Frankly, most ancient sources don't go on about her looks. It was her presence, her voice, her wit, her terrifying ability to make you feel like she already knew your darkest secret and was holding it for later. When she first met Julius Caesar, she didn't wait for an invitation. She had herself smuggled into his quarters, rolled up in a rug. Yes, a literal rug. Historians still debate whether this was theatrical genius or pure survival instinct. Probably both. She knew her brother husband, you heard that right, wanted her dead. Caesar, on the other hand, wanted control of Egypt. So she offered him something better herself, and the Nile. You peek through a linen curtain into the royal bedroom. It's not garish. No piles of gold or lion pelt sheets. Just understated luxury, papyrus-scented oil, polished ebony, and scrolls stacked beside the bed. Cleopatra didn't just seduce with her body, she seduced with her mind. She could quote Homer in Greek lecture Roman generals on Egyptian astronomy and hold her own in Senate-level debates, all while reclining under a fan and applying eyeliner. After Caesar's assassination, she pivoted smoothly, coldly, brilliantly to Mark Antony. He was impulsive, passionate, a war hero, easy to lure, hard to control. Their affair was theatrical from the start. They dressed as gods. They staged mock feasts as Dionysus and Isis. Once Cleopatra allegedly dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it just to win a bet. That's not flirtation, that's power cosplay. And oh, the gossip. Rome seethed. A woman, an Eastern woman, had two of their greatest men under her spell. Outrageous. Tabloids would have exploded. Pamphlets did. Octavian, soon to be Augustus, launched a smear campaign painting her as a sorceress who used sex to destroy honorable Roman men. It worked. She became villain and icon in a single scroll. But behind the theatrics, there was a real relationship, maybe even real affection. Antony fathered 3 children with Cleopatra. He gave her Cyprus, Phoenicia, and parts of Syria. Historians still argue whether he was bewitched or just willing. Either way, he chose her over Rome, and it killed him. You walk through a cool, dark chamber lined with papyrus shelves. In the corner, a low bronze brazier smolders. On the wall, a faded mural shows Cleopatra and Antony dining on a boat by torchlight servants fanning lotus blossoms over their heads. It's romantic and a little ridiculous, but their end, anything but. When Octavian's forces closed in, they tried to hold Alexandria. They failed. Antony told Cleopatra was dead, fell on his sword. She wasn't. She had him brought to her bleeding, dying, still reaching for her. He died in her arms. Days later, she would do the same, possibly by snakebite, possibly poison. Historians are still arguing about that one too. The only certainty, she dressed in her finest clothes, adorned herself with jewels, and made her exit on her own terms. Her death marked the end of the Ptolemaic dynasty and the final breath of pharaonic Egypt. Rome took the throne, and yet, Cleopatra lives on. Because no one before or since has so perfectly combined romance and realpolitik. She didn't fall in love, she aimed it. Her body was not just her own, it was a throne, a battlefield, and sometimes a trap. You linger in the royal bath now, steam curling around columns, a faint echo of laughter hanging in the air. One of her attendants once whispered that Cleopatra could make a man forget his oath, his kingdom, his gods, with a single story told at the right moment. So maybe it wasn't sorcery. Maybe it was just knowing exactly how to make someone feel like history was happening between the sheets. As you leave the palace, you glance back. The door closes slowly, silently. No fanfare. But you know what waits inside: soft, light, sharper words, and a queen who understood that the most intimate moments are sometimes the most calculated. You pass through a gate painted vermilion and gold, into a courtyard lined with carved jade. Lanterns swing softly from lacquered beams as evening settles like silk over the forbidden city. Welcome to Imperial China, where intimacy is whispered, ritualized, and meticulously ranked. Tonight, you're entering not a bedroom, but an ecosystem. And at its center, a man who holds absolute power and hundreds of women competing to spend just one night by his side. The emperor doesn't choose his partners casually. His schedule is logged in the Yuezhi, the palace's official record. Every night, concubines are summoned in rotation. No one's improvising. You're witnessing intimacy by spreadsheet. You watch from the shadowed edge of a polished corridor as an attendant carries a slip of bamboo inscribed with a name. This tiny sliver holds the fate of a girl trained since childhood to be beautiful, obedient, and unfailingly fertile. She waits behind a silk-screen, hair-perfumed body powdered with crushed pearls, taught to hide every feeling but desire. If her name is selected tonight, she'll be bathed, dressed, and this is real, carried to the emperor's chambers in a quilted blanket, so her feet never touch the floor. It's not sensual, it's ceremonial. And yet, it's still a test. You slip behind the screen and see her fingers tremble as the eunuchs approach. These men, castrated before puberty, serve as both guardians and informants. They control access. They whisper into the emperor's ear. One of them adjusts her collar with the detachment of someone who's seen too many fates sealed under the scent of jasmine. Intimacy in imperial China isn't about love. It's about legacy. If a concubine becomes pregnant, she rises. If she gives birth to a son, she might rise even higher, perhaps, to the title of noble consort. Maybe even empress if luck or scheming is on her side. But that luck can turn. One scroll from the Tang dynasty tells the story of consort Yang, beloved of Emperor Xuanzong. She was said to be so beautiful that fruit stopped ripening in her presence, awed by her perfection. Whether that's metaphor or just great PR, who knows? But her influence was real, too real. When rebellion swept through the empire, the emperor's soldiers blamed her. They demanded her execution. And so under the same roof where she once danced and whispered in Xuanzong's ear, she was strangled with a silk cord. Historians still debate whether it was politics or love that doomed her. Maybe both. The line between affection and threat was thin as rice paper. You're now wandering the back gardens, carefully groomed, unnervingly silent. Two concubines pass, not speaking, but their glances say everything. In this palace, women are ranked in layers, empress at the top, followed by the noble consorts, pure consorts, and so on. Each rank has rules when they may speak, how many maids they command, how ornate their robes may be. Even the emperor's attention is measured. If he visits you too often, the court whispers. If he doesn't visit at all, you vanish socially first, then perhaps physically. There are records of women who went decades without being summoned, locked in shadowy wings, growing old behind red lacquer doors. Fringe tales whisper of poisoners, false pregnancies, and switched infants. One particularly chilling anecdote involves a concubine who faked a miscarriage to frame her rival. It worked for 3 weeks. Then she was discovered and executed. But her rival still demoted. Why? Because intimacy wasn't just between people. It was political currency, and someone always had to pay. But among the scheming and silence, there were real bonds. The Kangxi emperor, ruling in the Qing dynasty, was said to have genuinely loved one of his consorts, consort Rong. He granted her private audiences, broke protocol to dine with her, even paused court for 3 days upon her death. Her tomb was unusually elaborate for her rank, a quiet rebellion in marble and pine. You pass through the calligraphy hall, where poems written by concubines have been preserved. Some are wistful, others bitter. One reads, "He looked at me once, then forgot me forever. The peony I planted never bloomed again." It's not dramatic, it's resigned. And somehow that cuts deeper. But don't assume all concubines were helpless. Some were exceptionally shrewd. Empress Wu Zetian began as a concubine and rose to become the only woman to rule China in her own name. Her path ruthless, but her legacy unshakable. She's still discussed today with awe, suspicion, and a healthy dose of fear. Eunuchs too played dangerous roles in this web. Some became kingmakers. One named Wei Zhongxian practically ran the Ming court for a decade, wielding influence over the emperor's personal and political life alike. Scholars still argue whether his rise was due to skill manipulation or sheer survival instincts sharpened to a blade. As you return to the main palace corridor, you pause beside a screen painted with cranes in flight. Behind it, you hear quiet weeping, not dramatic. Just a single woman, maybe 18, mourning a name not drawn tonight. Or perhaps remembering a night that meant more to her than it did to him. Because here's the truth: in the Forbidden City, intimacy wasn't forbidden. It was prescribed, logged, rotated, and weaponized. But that doesn't mean it wasn't real. It just had to be hidden under layers of protocol beneath robes stitched with phoenixes and rules too ancient to challenge. So you slip away as the lanterns flicker out, leaving behind a palace where love walks on tiptoe, where desire is measured in imperial edicts, and where a single night in the emperor's bed could rewrite a woman's entire life, or erase it. The air turns warmer now, heavy with sandalwood and distant chanting. You step into a world rich with ink-stained palm leaves, golden temples, and sensual scripts etched into time itself. Welcome to ancient India, where intimacy wasn't hidden in corners or whispered through veils, but explored, documented, and elevated to divine art. You're walking into a civilization where pleasure was philosophy and the bedroom a sacred learning ground. You move through a quiet garden within a palace in Pataliputra. The stone paths are smooth beneath your feet, winding between lotus pools and banana trees. Here in a shaded pavilion, a scroll lies unrolled on a low table. Its name, you know it, Kama Sutra. Yes, that Kama Sutra, but forget what pop culture has done to it. This isn't just a manual of acrobatics and improbable angles. It's a guide to living well compiled by the sage Vatsyayana sometime between the 3rd and 5th centuries CE. It covers conversation, courtship, scent, music, architecture, and yes, techniques of intimacy. But mostly it's about connection. Not just of bodies, but of minds, status, and purpose. In this world, you don't just fall into bed. You earn your way in. You peek inside a classroom in a royal court, not of warriors, but of women. Noble daughters trained in the 64 arts, singing, painting, perfumery, disguised storytelling, and even solving riddles mid-kiss. Intimacy was not passive here. It was a cultivated, intentional expression of grace, wit, and spiritual alignment. A mainstream fact. In early Hindu traditions, kama desire was one of the 4 aims of life alongside dharma duty, artha wealth, and moksha liberation. Desire wasn't seen as sin. It was part of being human. Deny it, you disrupted harmony. Indulge it wisely, you honored the divine. You pass by a couple seated under a neem tree. The man plays a veena. The woman listens not coyly but critically, correcting a missed note with a laugh. They're lovers, yes, but also collaborators in pleasure. This is not male dominance masquerading as affection. This is mutual artistry, and yet structure still shaped who could touch whom. Marriage in ancient India varied across caste, region, and era. In some traditions, it was arranged when the bride was very young, still a child. In others, women had a choice. One ceremony called a svayamvara allowed a bride to choose from a group of suitors by placing a garland around the neck of the one she favored. You imagine the tension as warriors, scholars, and royals lined up, each trying to hide his nerves while looking aloof. Swipe right, 4th century style. But marriage didn't always mean intimacy. Some couples lived in celibacy for spiritual reasons. Others entered Gandharva marriages, unofficial unions based on mutual attraction and, well, opportunity. Society might frown, but the gods often applauded. You hear giggling now behind a lattice carved with lotus motifs. 2 women whisper, exchanging verses from Gita Govinda, a 12th century Sanskrit poem about the love between Krishna and Radha. Their eyes shine with mischief. Their voices dip low as the stanzas turn sultry. Love in this culture isn't always heterosexual, and certainly not always restrained. Some temple sculptures depict men, women, and women all joined in curves and limbs that ignore modern taboos. And speaking of temples, you arrive at Khajuraho. The sun glints off sandstone carved centuries ago, where every inch of wall is alive with figures dancing, embracing, laughing mid-lovemaking. These aren't voyeuristic. They're celebratory. Sensuality here is a pathway to transcendence. To see the body as divine is to treat intimacy as ritual. Historians still debate whether the temples were purely symbolic or if actual tantric rituals were practiced inside. Some fringe texts suggest priestesses and monks engaged in spiritual union to channel Shakti cosmic energy. Others say it's art meant to remind pilgrims that enlightenment includes all human experience, not just the cloistered kind. You trace a carving of a couple frozen mid-embrace, their expressions serene. This isn't a conquest, it's a communion. But not everyone played by divine rules. Court life in ancient India could be cunning. You step into a royal harem where courtesans hold court of their own. They weren't just entertainers, they were educated, influential, and sometimes deadly. A famous tale from the Maurya era speaks of a dancer who seduced a spy sent to assassinate her patron. By the time he realized she'd drugged his wine, she was already in the emperor's chambers, promoted. Historians call it fringe. You call it efficient. And then there's the Devadasis, women dedicated to temple service, often from a young age. Originally honored as sacred performers, their roles became blurred over time, entangled with political favor and sexual obligation. Were they empowered or exploited? Historians still argue. Some lived rich, independent lives. Others were trapped in systems that spoke of goddesses while stealing girls' futures. You find yourself now in a simple village courtyard watching an older couple break a jackfruit together. No fanfare, no statues. But the way he brushes a fly from her sleeve says more than all the shlokas in the world. Because for all its drama, intimacy in ancient India often came down to this presence, patience, and shared mango slices on a humid evening. You pass a scribe copying verses by lamplight. His page reads, "She who knows the 5 ways to glance and the 3 kinds of sighs needs no other weapon." You smile. In this land, desire could be as gentle as a look or as fierce as a flame. So you leave the scrolls and incense behind, understanding that here, intimacy was never accidental. It was art, discipline, worship. A poem whispered into someone's ear that just might rewrite the soul. You cross a river now, low and slow beneath the moon, the scent of jasmine and wood smoke thick in the night air. The boatman hums an old tune as you drift toward Angkor, Cambodia's ancient jewel seat of the Khmer Empire, and home to temples that flirt with the clouds. But you're not here to admire stone carvings, not exactly. You're here to glimpse what they never wrote down, how intimacy pulsed through an empire of gods and kings. As you pass under vine-covered arches and step onto the causeway toward Angkor, what your breath catches. The bas-reliefs stretch endlessly, battle scenes, celestial dancers, and processions of kings. But hidden among them, if you look closely enough, are quiet clues, a hand on a waist, a glance over a shoulder, lips too close to be casual. These aren't accidents. The Khmer elite believed in Devaraja, the god king, and where there were divine rulers, there were divine pleasures. You find yourself now in the king's private quarters. Unlike the open forums of Rome or the rigid bureaucracy of China, this space feels fluid, more jungle than palace. Here, the line between sacred and sensual blurs. The king's lovers weren't just companions. They were symbols, embodiments of fertility, cosmic order, and sometimes political leverage. One mainstream fact: Khmer rulers maintained large harems staffed with consorts who came from across the empire. They weren't just trophies, they were tributes. Noble families sent daughters to court, not only to serve, but to bind their loyalties to the throne. These women were trained in music, dance, and etiquette. But unlike some other courts, they were also expected to perform in temple ceremonies as apsaras. You peek into a rehearsal chamber now, where 6 young women twist and bend their fingers into elaborate mudras. These gestures aren't arbitrary. Each one tells a story, echoes a myth. The dance of the Apsara wasn't just entertainment, it was theology in motion. To dance well was to please both the gods and the king. And the king, he watched from a carved balcony above, veiled by silks, deciding who would share his chamber, based not just on beauty, but on movement, rhythm, precision. It's said that King Jayavarman VII could choose a favorite just by the way she finished a spin. Of course, not all was divine choreography. Behind the temple walls, power games played out in silence. One fringe tale, unconfirmed but persistent, speaks of a consort who used herbal infusions to induce sleep in her rivals. Another tells of a dancer who rose so high in the king's favor that a jealous minister accused her of sorcery. She vanished before sunrise. No record. Just one pair of anklets left behind, placed on the palace steps, like an offering or a warning. You slip now into a bath chamber carved from rose stone. The water is warm, scented with lemongrass and frangipani. A low couch nearby is draped in linen worn from use. A young servant murmurs that the king prefers this chamber for first visits. You don't ask what that means. You already know. Intimacy here isn't loud. It flows like the canals that irrigate the rice fields, like the verses etched on palm leaf manuscripts. Lovers weren't praised with grand declarations, but with whispered poems. One scrap found near Ta Prohm Temple reads, "Your breath on my neck was a prayer I never learned to forget." And yet even prayers have politics. The Khmer Empire was built on sacred architecture and celestial order. When a king fathered a child, it wasn't just lineage, it was cosmology. His partner wasn't a woman. She was a womb for future deities. That's why so many temples are arranged around the sacred mountain Mount Meru, with central shrines representing fertility. Every act of intimacy, if done within the right ritual bounds, echoed the union of gods and goddesses. But step outside those bounds, dangerous. One inscription from a temple guardian warns of punishments for unsanctified acts under sacred roofs. Translation: don't get handsy near the altar unless you're really sure you're part of a divine narrative. And what of ordinary people? You head into the village that hums just beyond the shadow of the palace. Here, young couples meet at water wells, their conversation filled with shy jokes and borrowed proverbs. A girl shows a boy how to fold banana leaves into tiny boats. He pretends not to know, just to keep her close longer. There were no apps, no poetry contests, but there were rules. Dowries were negotiated with incense and rice. Weddings involved days of ritual, from hair washing to fortune reading and consummation. It wasn't expected in public, it was honored in hush. Still, real love crept in. One local tale recorded centuries later in a poem speaks of a farmer who carved his lover's name into a hidden lintel stone. Not grand, not political, just permanent. Today, archaeologists still argue over its origin. Was it an act of devotion or just graffiti with good branding? Either way, it's still there. You return to Angkor Thom now, where twilight glints off the faces of Bayon, dozens of serene smiles carved in every direction. Maybe they're the king's. Maybe they're his lovers. Maybe they're reminders that intimacy here was always both seen and unseen. And as you stand beneath the banyan tree near the old library, you hear music rise, a soft, rhythmic pulse carried by a bamboo flute. You imagine a dancer's silhouette behind a curtain, hips swaying like leaves. The king watches, not just as ruler, but as witness to something older than empires. Because in the Khmer court, intimacy wasn't just pleasure. It was power wrapped in grace. A smile in the corner of a mural, a hand tracing history on a lover's spine, a quiet offering to both gods and ghosts. You step softly now into a land of drums and ivory towers, where minarets kiss the clouds and the scent of rose attar clings to the air like a secret. Welcome to the world of the Islamic caliphates, where intimacy flowed beneath the call to prayer behind carved screens and within pages more seductive than silk. This isn't a story of repression. This is a story of boundaries, yes, but also of beauty, longing, and nights perfumed with poetry. The muezzin calls out from the mosque as you enter a courtyard in Baghdad at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate. Around you, fountains shaped like stars, gardens brimming with citrus, and scrolls stacked on shelves like treasure. This is the Golden Age, and the capital doesn't just produce scholars, it births philosophers of love. A mainstream fact. The Abbasid era saw the translation of thousands of Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, including medical treatises on human anatomy and sexual health. Far from taboo, knowledge about the body was catalogued, debated, and even eroticized. A doctor named Al-Razi wrote frankly about desire and pleasure. A scholar named Al-Nafzawi composed The Perfumed Garden, a guide that mixed sensuality, humor, and advice like, "Do not neglect the importance of gentle teasing, for even the rose takes time to open." You slip into a private room of a wealthy merchant's house. No palace, but richly adorned brocaded cushions, lattice windows filtering moonlight, and a chest of love poems bound in red leather. The wife here is not veiled in her own home. She's lounging with one leg tucked under her, sipping pomegranate syrup, laughing over a riddle that is definitely about anatomy. Her husband returns it with a line from 1001 Nights. Because yes, that book. We have to talk about it. Alf Layla wa Layla, The 1001 Nights, isn't just tales of genies and flying carpets. It's a framework of survival through storytelling. Scheherazade, the narrator, faces death every dawn. To survive, she seduces her husband, not with her body, but with narrative. She keeps him hooked night after night until something changes. He falls in love, or maybe in awe. Historians still debate whether it was romance or redemption. Either way, the blade never falls. And her stories. They are not all family-friendly. Some are explicit, others satirical. Many are soaked in innuendo. A fisherman seduces a jinn's wife. A merchant accidentally marries a shape-shifting camel. You know, typical bedtime material. In the real court, intimacy was even more layered. Caliphs kept harems, yes, but not in the pejorative way later tales would imply. A harem literally meant forbidden or sacred. It was a separate space often filled with wives, concubines, female relatives, and attendants. It wasn't just a pleasure dome, it was a political ecosystem. You passed through the beaded curtains of a harem in Cordoba, where poetry is pinned to the walls in fragrant ink. One woman, Zainab, is teaching music. Another, Noor, reads Persian poetry aloud while braiding her friend's hair. These women are educated, eloquent, and in some cases powerful. The mother of the caliph might advise on affairs of state. A favorite concubine might rise to empress. Take the real-life figure of Walida bint al-Mustakfi, an Andalusian princess and poet who ran her own literary salon. She refused to veil war verses embroidered on her clothes and wrote love poems to both men and women. One of her lovers, Ibn Zaydun, a poet who later lamented their breakup for decades in his verses. She once wrote, "I am made for glory, and I walk proudly among the stars." Not bad for someone history nearly tried to forget. But let's not romanticize too much. While many women found intellectual and emotional power in these circles, others had no choice. Concubines were often enslaved, trafficked into courts from across Asia, Africa, and Europe. Some rose through cleverness. Others were trapped in silk cages. Historians still argue how much agency they truly had. Some fragments from abandoned letters hint at deep loneliness. One line reads, "He remembers my song, but not my name." And yet, in this paradoxical world of devotion and decorum, passion thrived. You find a small garden tucked behind an old madrasa where lovers have carved verses into a fig tree's trunk. One reads, "My hand touched hers briefly, like a verse escaping the reed before the ink dried." There's no scandal in that, only sweetness. And what of men, brotherhoods of poetry and philosophy flourished, many laced with erotic undertones. Some Sufi mystics described divine love through metaphors of intimate union. Jalaluddin Rumi's verses burn not just with spiritual yearning, but with very human ache. Scholars still debate whether his muse, Shams of Tabriz, was friend-lover or manifestation of the divine. Maybe all three. You sit beneath a date palm, now watching two scholars debate the merits of udri love, platonic yet painful, where the lover never consummates his desire. It was a literary genre, and sometimes a way to express forbidden love without punishment. It made heartbreak not just poetic, but virtuous. Even the law was complicated. Islamic jurisprudence permitted sexual pleasure within marriage, and even allowed discussion of technique in certain legal texts. But anything beyond that was dangerous ground. Intimacy outside the bonds of marriage could mean disgrace or death. And yet love found a way to survive. In lyrics, in perfume recipes, in letters tied with gold thread. You watch the stars rise above the domes of Samara, each one a silent witness to 1,000 secret trysts. Lovers here knew how to wait, to write, to hide their names in the folds of a poem, and to speak more with a glance than most can say in a lifetime. Because here intimacy wasn't loud, it was lush, lyrical, learned. And when morning came, it dressed in verse and walked away before anyone could ask who had visited in the night. Now the night hushes again, and the wind shifts west across desert sands and coastal harbors until the scent of dates and sea salt gives way to incense and smoke. You've arrived in medieval West Africa, where the earth is red, the gold glitters beneath it, and love songs echo through the savannah under baobab trees older than memory. Welcome to the empires of Mali and Songhai, where griots remember everything, where trade caravans bring silk and salt and secrets, and where intimacy hums not in palaces alone, but in courtyards, circles, and fireside tales. This is not a world of written love manuals. This is a world where intimacy is sung. You begin in Timbuktu, not the mythical nowhere people joke about, but the real thriving center of Islamic scholarship, with libraries built from mud brick and minds sharp as obsidian. You duck into a manuscript house past scrolls that speak of astronomy, medicine, even marriage law. One cracked leather-bound text outlines how a husband should smile before asking for obedience, and how a wife's pleasure is part of the contract, not outside it. A mainstream fact. Many West African Islamic jurists wrote extensively about mutual respect in marriage well before certain European cultures even considered it polite to ask. But writing isn't where the real music is. You follow the sound of a kora, a harp lute that weaves melodies like vines around your ears. A griot sits cross-legged, eyes half closed, singing of a woman who turned down 5 chiefs for the smile of a salt trader. His fingers pluck notes like footsteps in sand, and the audience leans closer. Intimacy here is layered, emotional, spiritual, and deeply social. Marriage isn't just about 2 people. It's 2 families, 2 lineages, 2 village circles. And yes, sometimes 2 competing matriarchs. The bride's aunt might negotiate more firmly than the bride herself. The groom's mother might pretend to be unimpressed, even if she's already prepping the stew. Still, desire isn't shamed, it's danced. At a Fulani Garawal festival, young men line up painted in ochre and indigo, their faces adorned with beads, their teeth bared in practiced grins. They sing, sway, and flutter their eyes, yes, flutter, to attract the attention of watching women. And the women they choose, publicly, boldly. One might walk up to a dancer and tap his chest. That's her pick. They'll disappear for the night, and the next morning return sometimes to laughter, sometimes with new plans. It's real. It's ritual. And it's very much hers to decide. You trail one such pair now, giggling behind woven grass huts, leaving behind the thump of drums, and into a quiet grove. She asks him if he can cook. He lies. She knows. That's half the fun. Meanwhile, in royal circles, intimacy often wore ceremonial robes. You enter the palace of Mansa Musa not during his famous Hajj, but during one of his quieter evenings. A line of courtiers bows low. The women of his household pass by in embroidered veils, each holding a different role: advisor, entertainer, mother of heirs. One scroll from this period describes how queens and consorts were often educated and trusted with managing estates, and occasionally diplomacy. But like in many empires, not all women chose their roles. Enslavement was a fact of the court. Captives taken from wars or traded across Sahel routes became concubines. Some rose in rank, others remained anonymous. One fringe tale tells of a woman from the East who sang in a tongue no one understood, and who bore a son that would one day lead cavalry into Gao. Truth, myth. With griots, it doesn't really matter. All stories are seeds. In village life, however, things were more intimate in the literal sense. Homes were close. Everyone heard everything. Courting was done in whispers, songs or riddles passed through cousins. One popular game involved tossing a carved nut to your crush. If they caught it, they had to answer a question about the stars. If they dropped it, you had to cook for them. Either way, win. You stop at a nighttime gathering around a fire. A grandmother tells a tale of the moon wife, a spirit who fell in love with a mortal man, but only came to him on cloudless nights. If he spoke her name aloud, she'd vanish. He never did. The story ends not in tragedy, but in a quiet acceptance. Some loves live better in silence, and silence had its own language. One woman might dye her veil a specific color to signal interest. A man might carve a pattern into a calabash bowl before gifting it. A shared proverb might mean, "I'm watching," or "I'm waiting." Scholars still argue how much of this was romantic and how much was strategic. Was love a reason or an excuse to forge alliances between clans? Did rituals emerge from desire or from inheritance law? In truth, both. But among all the strategy, there was softness. You pass a hut where a young husband braids his wife's hair under starlight. She grumbles about how long he's taking. He says it's because her hair is as thick as elephant memory. She rolls her eyes. He grins. One ancient song still sung today ends like this: I gave her millet, she gave me thunder. I gave her honey, she gave me her wrist. Because here intimacy is a dance. It moves with rhythm and risk, with poetry and partnership. It's in the beat of a drum, the arch of an eyebrow, the scent of roasted groundnuts shared between bites. You walk away under a moon so bright, it makes the savannah silver. Somewhere a kora plays again, and a new love story begins, no scroll needed. Just to voice a heartbeat and maybe one well-aimed carved nut. The scent of cloves rides the breeze as you now cross the sea to the islands Java, Bali, and the courts of Majapahit, where kings ruled rainforests with bronze gongs and golden dancers, and where love was a language spoken through shadow puppets and sandalwood smoke. This is Southeast Asia in its medieval bloom, a world where the sacred and the sensual don't clash, they waltz. You arrive at a temple complex during dusk prayers. Bells chime softly. In the shadows of volcanic stone relief carvings twine gods with mortals, snakes with vines, thighs with hands. You run your fingers across a panel depicting a couple mid-embrace, nothing grotesque, nothing ashamed. Just quiet, carved elegance. Their eyes closed, their bodies fluid. This is not seduction. This is serenity. Because in Majapahit and its surrounding kingdoms, intimacy was not simply tolerated, it was considered an echo of divine balance. The union of male and female forces known as Purusha and Prakriti mirrored the harmony between cosmic elements. A mainstream historical fact in tantric-influenced traditions of Java and Bali, physical pleasure was considered part of spiritual alignment. To love well was to live aligned with your breath, your partner, your ancestors. You're ushered now into a wooden pavilion where a gamelan orchestra hums to life. A young dancer takes the floor, barefoot wrists, fluid eyes cast downward. Her movements are precise, but her intention is not cold. Each tilt of her head, each flick of her fan is layered with meaning, and the men watching silent, respectful. Because in this culture, seduction was a skill, not a scandal. Just beyond the curtain, the dalang or puppet master begins a wayang kulit performance. His leather puppets, delicately cut and painted, tell stories of gods, kings, and often impossible love. Tonight's tale, Arjuna and Subhadra, a warrior and a princess, torn by duty, drawn by longing. As the shadow play flickers across a cloth screen, children watch wide-eyed. But in the back row, a young couple's fingers brush beneath the mat. Their story is quieter, but no less real. Courtship here was rarely direct. It moved through intermediaries, riddles, and gifts. A betel leaf folded with cloves. A silk sash left accidentally behind after a ceremony. Parents arranged much, but not all. Some girls slipped away in the night, eloping by moonlight, returning home with nothing but a new husband and an eyebrow raised just so. Inside royal courts, things were far more layered. You pass into the palace of a Javanese queen, Regent Tribhuwana Wijayatunga Dewi, a historical powerhouse who ruled the Majapahit Empire in the 14th century. Her advisors bow low. Her guards speak little. Her consort nowhere in sight. Because sometimes in this world, the woman held the throne and the reins, and the lovers came later. One fringe legend tells of a noblewoman who took 3 lovers each for a different purpose. One for conversation, one for laughter, and one for the evenings. Her husband was said to approve he liked to play the flute while she chose her guest. Fact, maybe not. But like all legends, it's lasted longer than the disapproval it probably caused. And while women were expected to be modest in public, the private sphere allowed space for nuance. You find yourself in a courtyard where a group of women lounge in cotton sarongs discussing their husband's quirks with affectionate mockery. One mimics her spouse's snore, another laughs. At least he stays awake long enough to light the incense. They giggle like birds before a storm, bright, noisy, and untouchable. The arts offered another route to closeness. Love poetry known as kakawin was as refined as the architecture. A well-known verse from the Smaradhana reads, "Her glance fell on him like moonlight on a sacred pool, too soft to disturb the water, too deep to forget." Tell us how you really feel, anonymous 13th century court poet. You drift now through the rice terraces where village life speaks its own rhythm. Here lovers exchange songs during harvest festivals, disguising flirtation as folk chant. One man sings, "My basket is full, but my hands are empty." A woman nearby answers, "Then borrow mine, but mind the thorns." Everyone claps. Everyone knows. No one says a word. Weddings could be grand or humble, but always symbolic. The joining of palms, the sharing of turmeric rice, the wrapping of bodies in a single length of cloth. But consummation that was private, not shamed simply, not performed for others. Unless, of course, you believe the fringe tales about dancers trained to demonstrate for young couples. Some say it was ritual, some say it was myth. Scholars still argue whether this was spiritual instruction or just very niche theater. You pause beneath a frangipani tree now, where an elderly couple drinks tea in silence. He swats a mosquito from her ankle without looking. She leans against his shoulder. There are no poems here. No gongs, no incense. Just knowing. Just presence. But the ghosts remember. One story, half whispered, half sung, tells of a princess who loved a sculptor. She could never marry him, so she asked him to carve her likeness onto the corner of a temple wall. He did, but he also carved his own face beside hers, small and hidden just under her elbow. It was never noticed until centuries later, when time had worn away the gods but left the lovers untouched. That too is intimacy. And so you leave the island temples behind the sound of gamelan fading like footsteps in fog. Love here wasn't loud. It was folded like a letter, tied in rice straw, etched into stone so carefully you might never see it, unless you were already in love yourself. The drums now grow distant, replaced by ocean wind and the slap of sails. You cross to the far edge of the known world, or at least what medieval Europe once called it, Japan. A land of painted screens, brushed poetry, and silence so heavy it's almost sacred. Welcome to the Heian Court, where intimacy was a moonlit secret, wrapped in 12 silk layers and carried on the back of a haiku. You glide past a bamboo grove into Kyoto, circa 1000 CE. The city is hushed, refined, almost padded. Even the birds seem quieter. This is not a culture of declarations or conquests. This is the art of restraint. The whisper, the pause. Inside the palace, candlelight flickers over tatami mats. You hear the rustle of silk, junihito, the 12-layered robe of a noblewoman. She's writing. Of course she is. In the Heian court, everyone writes. Love was not shouted, it was calligraphed. A mainstream fact, Heian aristocrats communicated romantic intent through waka poems, 31-syllable bursts of beauty. If your poem was returned the next morning on equally fine paper, with matching ink and metaphor, you were in. If not, ouch. Better luck with your brushwork next time. You peek into a private chamber. A young noblewoman hides behind a low screen, her face never seen by her suitor. She answers his poem with her own. He replies. This exchange might go on for weeks before they even meet, and when they do, it's likely under cover of darkness. He'll sneak into her room after sunset and leave before dawn. No grand entrances, just a creaking floorboard and the rustle of robes. And what happens between dusk and dawn, that's where the ambiguity thrives. Much of what we know comes from the tale of Genji, written by Murasaki Shikibu, a court lady poet, and perhaps the world's first true novelist. Her protagonist, Genji, is handsome, cultured, poetic, and very, very busy. He writes love notes, charms, married women, mourns his own heartbreaks, and occasionally adopts a girl just to raise her into his ideal partner. Yes, it's complex. Scholars still debate the ethics, fiercely. You pass through Murasaki's imagined world now, and it's filled with beauty laced in melancholy. Lovers meet under the plum blossoms. They part without saying goodbye. A single hairpin left behind might mean more than a letter. A lingering scent on a robe might haunt you for years. And yes, scent mattered. A lot. Heian men wore robes infused with custom incense blends. Women, too. You weren't just remembered by your name or your face, but by your fragrance. There are court records describing a man as one who smells of plum and regret. You wish you'd thought of that insult in high school. Fringe stories tell of incense contests where lovers identified each other blindfolded by scent alone. It sounds romantic until you realize how much pressure that puts on your laundry routine. Not all was ethereal, though. Court life had its jealousies. One poem recovered from a neglected diary reads, "He wrote her in spring and me in rain, yet both notes were scented with the same regret." Hoof. Outside the palace, commoners had their own rhythms. While noble intimacy was veiled in metaphor, villagers met at festivals, flirted over lanterns, and danced beneath floating candles. Marriages were often arranged, but not unfeeling. A well-made meal, a roof repaired, without asking a child carried on one's back. That was the language of love for the farmer and the fisher. And in the Buddhist monasteries dotting the hills, intimacy took a different shape, often denied, sometimes redirected. But scrolls suggest quiet crushes, spiritual yearning disguised as poetry, and even coded affection passed between monks. Scholars still debate how widespread this was, but the verse is there. One goes, "In your chant, I heard the sea, and for a moment I forgot the shore." You pass a bridge now, lacquered red and wet with mist. A woman stands there reading a letter by lantern light. You can't see the words, but her lips move silently, repeating something. Perhaps it's a poem. Perhaps it's a promise. In this world, love rarely screams. It rarely even speaks, but it lingers, in folded fans, in pressed leaves, in the way one person places your Geta sandals beside the door, pointing the right way home. Even marriage wasn't a simple contract. In Heian, Japan, women often remained in their family homes, and husbands visited them there. This Tsumatori-kan wife-visiting marriage meant that the bond was flexible, sometimes fluid, and not always lifelong. Some women took multiple lovers. Some men moved between homes like drifting clouds. Love was less about possession than presence. One fringe tale tells of a lady who sent her favorite lover away because she dreamed of a fox warning her he'd bring misfortune. She died years later, unmarried, her room filled with carefully stored letters and the faint smell of cedar. Historians say it's apocryphal, but her scrolls are real, stored in a Kyoto archive under lock and whisper. As dawn creeps in, you hear a soft knock on a screen door. A young man slips inside. He kneels beside a sleeping woman, lays a poem near her pillow, and vanishes before the light touches the floor. She stirs, reads, and smiles without opening her eyes. Because in Heian, Japan, true intimacy doesn't demand your gaze. It only asks for your breath, your brushstroke, your patience. So you leave the court behind the morning sun filtering through reeds and rising mist, and you think maybe the loudest kind of love is the one that never needed to shout. A colder breeze now drifts in, carrying the scent of pine, wet stone, and wood smoke. You find yourself surrounded by mountain ridges and fortress walls, thick, gray, imposing. You've arrived in medieval Europe, where love was tangled in hierarchy, where intimacy lived under locked parchment and prayer. This is the land of chivalry and chastity belts, or at least that's what the stories say. The truth far more tangled and far more human. You slip into a castle on a damp afternoon. The torches smoke. The stairs creak. A tapestry rustles faintly as you pass, stitched with saints and lions. But also, if you squint, two lovers tucked into the corner, hidden among the vines. Even embroidery has secrets. In the grand hall, the Lord's wife oversees the servant's eyes-trained voice, gentle but sharp. She's wearing linen fur-lined with a pendant that might have been a gift or a bribe. Her husband sits at the far end of the table, slurping stew, more focused on hunting dogs than conversation. They were married for land, you realize. For alliances, not for laughter or butterflies. A mainstream fact. In most of medieval Europe, especially among the nobility, marriages were economic contracts. Love came later, if it came at all. That's why courtly love, with its sighs and sonnets and soul-wrenching poetry, wasn't about marriage. It was about everything marriage wasn't. You sneak into a lady's solar, a private chamber for needlework gossip, and the occasional extremely well-timed letter from a night abroad. She reads aloud softly. My heart sleeps not when your shadow rides the moon. She tucks it under her pillow. He'll never touch her. That's not the point. The ache is the point. Courtly love was famously non-physical, or at least it pretended to be. A lady married to a nobleman might be adored by a younger knight. He'd pledge loyalty, right versus maybe even wear her colors in battle. But touch her, no. Or at least not where anyone could prove it. Historians still argue whether these platonic relationships stayed platonic. Some letters suggest they did. Others, not so much. One fringe account from Aquitaine tells of a knight who was caught under a noblewoman's bed after a suspicious amount of lute music. His excuse, I dropped a rosary. Sure, buddy, you climb a narrow tower stair now, breath clouding. At the top, a chamber with a single narrow bed, a writing desk, and a window facing east. This is a monk's cell. Not romantic, right? Except you'd be surprised. Love found its way into monasteries too, though often disguised as spiritual longing. Take Abelard and Heloise, the philosopher, and his student who fell in love, secretly wed, and were brutally separated after their affair scandalized Paris. She became a nun, he a monk. They exchanged letters filled with theology and heartbreak. Her most famous line, I would rather be your mistress than the wife of any emperor. Not bad for a woman sworn to silence. You step now into a village tavern where the rules are looser. The baker flirts with the blacksmith's daughter. A barmaid laughs too long at the shepherd's joke. Intimacy among peasants wasn't about poetry. It was about proximity. Who helped mend your thatch roof? Who walked you home after the market? Who shared the last bite of salted pork? Marriages were usually arranged, but not cold. One couple might live together before wedlock as a kind of test run. This wasn't scandalous, just practical. In some regions, particularly in Scandinavia and parts of the British Isles, hand-fasting was a common premarital custom. You held hands over a symbolic cord, promised fidelity, and that was that. Of course, the church didn't love this. Canon law insisted on formal vows of priest and absolutely no funny business before the wedding feast. But local customs, they had a way of ignoring distant bishops. Still, the church had power. You visit a cathedral now where a priest preaches against lust with a voice like thunder. Flesh is the enemy, he cries. Meanwhile, behind the altar, a deacon slips a note to the choir boy he's definitely not supposed to be noticing. Yeah, humans are consistent. One preserved confession from the 13th century includes the line, I did touch her ankle with intention, and we did laugh, and then she made a sign of the cross upon my forehead with wine. Scandalous maybe, or maybe just foreplay in Latin. You enter a scriptorium where monks copy texts with aching fingers. Among the illuminated margins, tiny doodles. A nun and a knight sharing a kiss. A bishop chasing a duck. You're not sure that one's about intimacy, but it feels loaded. Even nuns had their stories. Some convents were places of deep sisterhood spaces, where love, both platonic and romantic, flourished quietly. Historians debate the nature of these bonds. Some see spiritual friendship. Others see coded passion. One preserved letter reads, I folded your ribbon inside my psalter. It keeps the pages warm. You return to the castle now. In the courtyard, a young page stares longingly at the stable boy. They brush shoulders while mucking stalls. No one says anything. But in a century when even heterosexual unions were tightly controlled, queerness had to learn to live in the cracks disguised as loyalty, as service, as song. By the fire, an old woman sings an old tune, a love ballad handed down through generations. The lyrics are simple. He brought no gold. He brought no land. But he carried water when my hands could not. That's all it took. And so you leave medieval Europe behind, less armored than you expected, more poetic than the plague-riddled history books ever let on. Yes, the church loomed. Yes, the rules were rigid. But between the Psalms and the scrolls, people still found ways to love. They still wrote under candlelight, still brushed fingers across ink-stained parchment, still waited at gates, and sometimes they still dropped the rosary. The scent of spice hangs heavier now, clove, turmeric, frankincense. You cross into the world of the Ottoman Empire, a realm of crescents and courtyards, domes and desire, where sultans ruled with signatures on scrolls, but their hearts were often swayed by silken whispers behind lattice screens. Welcome to the empire where intimacy was architecture layered, walled, and exquisitely adorned. You pass beneath the monumental gates of Topkapi Palace, Istanbul's heart. The tiles shimmer blue and green in the afternoon light, calligraphy dancing across every surface. It's quiet, orderly, and then you enter the harem. Let's be clear, harem wasn't some opulent orgy den as Western fantasy novels love to imagine. A mainstream fact, harem comes from the Arabic haram, meaning sacred or forbidden. It referred to the private female-only quarters of the palace off-limits to all men except the sultan and his sons. It was a domain of power hierarchy and, yes, intimate politics. You glide past cloistered courtyards, where fountains murmur beside marble. Here, the sultan's mother, the Valid Sultan, wields enormous influence. Her quarters are the most opulent, her word law, even more so than the concubines who might share her son's bed. This matriarch often arranged which women would see the sultan controlled child-rearing and sometimes shaped foreign policy with a well-timed whisper. Further inside, you find the kadınlar, the concubines. Dozens, sometimes hundreds, depending on the era. Most were brought from across the empire, Circassian, Albanian, Georgian, North African, trained in music, poetry, dance, and etiquette. Some never advanced. Others rose fast. At the top, the Haseki Sultan, the sultan's favorite. Sometimes his official wife, sometimes not. Fringe tail one dancer from the Ukraine Roxolana caught Sultan Suleiman's eye and his heart. She rose from concubine to queen, bore his children, and helped him draft letters of state. One was addressed tenderly to my joy, my moonlight. It still survives. You peer into her old chamber, lavish, yes, but also intimate. Velvet cushions line the divan. A low table holds a bowl of candied rose petals. In the corner, a harp leans gently, its strings silent now. But you imagine her sitting there composing a lullaby for the son who might one day be sultan or might be executed in a succession purge. Love in the harem was never just about kisses. It was survival with eyeliner and those sons. Oh, the stakes were high. Sultans didn't have a tradition of primogeniture. That meant all sons of the sultan were theoretically eligible to inherit the throne, which also meant they were rivals. So intimacy wasn't just romantic, it was dynastic. Bearing a son meant securing your future, or painting a target on your back. Historians still debate whether the system was brilliance or barbarism. On one hand, the best man ruled. On the other, fratricide. One grim fact, Sultan Mehmed III had 19 brothers executed upon his ascension. 19. All born of the harem, all once cradled by women who now watched their sons die. Yet within those walls, love flourished too. You enter the cafes, the cage where potential heirs were kept in isolation to prevent plots. It sounds cruel, and it was. But one sultan imprisoned there for decades wrote volumes of poetry. He compared his loneliness to a caged bird and signed his verses Ashik the Lover. Scholars still argue whether his poems were meant for a woman in the harem, a fellow captive, or simply for freedom itself. And what about intimacy outside the palace? You walk through the city's winding streets now, where houses lean close and lattice windows keep gazes modest. Marriage was common, often arranged, but not always passionless. A typical Ottoman love letter might begin with, "My fig-eyed gazelle, when the moon is full, your absence makes my coffee bitter." Now that's a line. Even coffee was part of the game. A woman could test a suitor by the way he drank his cup. Too fast, impatient. Too slow, indecisive. No sugar, emotionally unavailable. Okay, maybe not that last one, but maybe. In some parts of the empire, particularly Anatolia and the Balkans, women had surprising freedom. They managed estates, owned businesses, and even initiated divorce. One preserved court record shows a wife listing her husband's sins as he did not speak kindly. He did not bathe. He ruined the lentils. Grounds granted. Back in the palace, you sneak into the bathhouse hammam. Steam coils like a veil. Marble slabs are warm beneath your feet. This was the social hub, yes, but also the setting for sensual preparation. The women scrubbed, perfumed, steamed. Every inch cared for. Because if tonight was your turn to be summoned, you had to shine like a sapphire. But sometimes it wasn't about the sultan. Fringe stories speak of romances between attendants, women who grew up together, shared secrets, and maybe once or twice more than secrets. A note found folded in the lining of an old pillowcase reads, "Your touch was softer than the soap." I remember still, historians avoid the subject. The silence says enough. You return now to the gardens where peacocks strut and the air smells of orange blossoms. A woman sits alone watching the moon rise. Maybe she's the favored one. Maybe she's waiting for her name to be called. Maybe she's already fallen in love with someone who will never be sultan. Because in the Ottoman world, intimacy wasn't just desire. It was destiny. Risk, ritual. A rose held between teeth. A glance through a veil. A life built on whether he turned left or right on his walk through the harem corridors. And in that palace of perfume and politics, every night held two questions: who would be chosen and who would survive the morning. The scent of cardamom fades, replaced now by dust heat and the sharp brightness of sunlight bouncing off red stone. You find yourself in Mughal India, where marble whispers secrets, gardens bloom for lovers, and the line between devotion and desire is inked in Persian calligraphy. Here, intimacy is not hidden, it's immortalized. You step into the sprawling courts of the Mughal emperors, where peacocks strutted, poets whispered, and every fountain seemed to mirror a deeper longing. You're in Agra now, at the threshold of a palace complex, where rosewater mists the air and the walls shimmer with inlaid gemstones. This is the empire of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, names etched into domes and dreams. The Mughals didn't merely love. They built their love into cities, into poems, into palaces so intricate they still blush in the morning sun. A mainstream fact, the Taj Mahal, India's most iconic monument, was built by Shah Jahan in memory of his favorite wife, Mumtaz Mahal. She bore him 14 children. She died in childbirth. He buried her under a dome of such haunting perfection, even his enemies were moved. The building isn't just a tomb. It's a confession, an apology, a vow. But before the marble, there was Memnon Palace, and before grief, there was seduction. You walk through the royal Zenana, the women's quarters, a city within the palace. Like the Ottoman harem, this was no passive retreat. It was the center of feminine power. The emperor's wives, concubines, and female relatives lived here shielded from the public, but deeply involved in politics, finance, even architectural planning. One imperial wife, Nur Jahan, wielded so much influence, she issued royal decrees, minted coins with her name, and according to one fringe account, personally designed the emperor's perfumes. He loved her most, one courtier whispered, because she never feared him. You wander into a garden modeled after paradise where water channels trace the 4 rivers of the Islamic Eden. A concubine sits on a cushion, twirling a pomegranate seed on her tongue, watching a poet compose verses in the shade. She's not just ornamental. She's watching to see if he's clever enough to capture her attention. Spoiler, he's not. Courtly intimacy here moved through language. Persian was the language of love and letters, and Mughal nobles wrote with lush abandon. One line preserved in the Baburnama reads, "Her voice was the musk that lingered on my morning robe." You could swoon just reading the margins. Letters weren't just for passion, they were currency. A well-phrased metaphor could earn you a night in the emperor's chamber, or a kingdom. Sometimes both. But love wasn't all poetry and politics. You follow a maidservant through a shaded passage into the emperor's private bath. An octagonal chamber, its ceiling painted with stars, its floor warm from the sun. Here lovers whispered through the steam. Here alliances were solidified with the brush of a hand. And yet even in this lush world, heartbreak lived. One concubine, unnamed in the records, was exiled after a failed plot to poison her rival's perfume. She left behind a box of letters, all written to the same man. Scholars still argue whether he was a court musician, a guard, or just a fantasy, but the longing unmistakable. Women weren't always voiceless, though. Elite Mughal women composed poetry, patronized the arts, and occasionally chose their lovers. One Rajput princess married into the court insisted on keeping her own deity's idol in her chamber. The emperor allowed it. Whether that was a sign of tolerance or of affection, that's still debated. Outside the palace walls, love bloomed more freely. In the bustling streets of Delhi, couples snuck glances through holly windows, arranged clandestine meetings at shrines, or passed notes hidden in flower garlands. Marriage was often arranged, yes, but affection was cultivated. A well-boiled cup of chai, a sari folded just so. A gesture never explained, always understood. Among the courtesans, Tawaif's intimacy became art. These women were not just dancers or singers. They were trained in etiquette, poetry, philosophy. To be chosen by one was an honor. To fall in love with one dangerous and inevitable. You step into a salon now where a Tawaif recites a ghazal, eyes flicking toward her favorite guest. Her voice trembles slightly on one line. I offered him silence, and he answered with exile. The others clap politely. He just bows his head. Their romances didn't always end in tragedy, though. One famous Tawaif was gifted land horses and a palace by her patron. They never married, but they were buried side by side. Their tombs face each other as if still in conversation. And yes, same-sex love existed here too. Fringe documents suggest some nobles kept male lovers, some poets addressed verses to other men. One Mughal prince is rumored to have traveled with a companion he refused to call a servant, though the records redact his name. The lines between love and loyalty, affection and arrangement were deliberately blurred. As dusk settles, You find yourself in the jasmine-scented garden of Itimadu Daula's tomb, a lesser-known gem, but no less lovely. A couple walks past, their hands brushing. You catch a snippet of verse. When I left your arms, even the breeze felt like betrayal. Because in Mughal India, intimacy wasn't just found in bedrooms or love letters. It was etched into architecture, tangled into song lyrics, and perfumed into every corner of courtly life. It was a glance through a screen, a reply in perfect Persian, a monument that still glows by moonlight. And in that marble world of shadows and silk, every love, consummated or not, became a part of the empire's story. You step away from marble and poetry, now drifting into lantern light and the soft rustle of silk against stone. Welcome to Imperial China, a vast layered tapestry of dynasties and dynasties within dynasties, where intimacy was as tightly choreographed as a tea ceremony and as unpredictable as a falling plum blossom. You arrive during the Tang dynasty, that golden age of culture and openness. The capital Chang'an throbs with life. Market stalls spill over with lychee jade lacquered combs. Courtesans stroll past with jasmine in their hair, trailing laughter like a veil. And inside the palace walls, power hums like a zither string. You slip through the outer gates into the imperial harem. Not a single space, but an entire hierarchy, concubines ranked, titled, recorded in scrolls thicker than a dynasty's ledger. A mainstream fact. The emperor's harem could contain hundreds of women, from empress down to ladies-in-waiting of the 7th rank. Your rank determined your room, your robes, even the direction you bowed. And to move up, well, beauty helped, but timing was everything. You pass a chamber where a concubine prepares herself not with bold paint, but with subtlety. She stains her lips with crushed flour paste. She inks a delicate half-moon between her brows. Then she composes a verse just in case he calls her tonight. Poetry was not optional. In the Tang court, the truly desirable didn't just look the part, they wrote it. Emperors composed verses for their favorites, and the best favorites replied with stanzas so elegant they became national treasures. One famous exchange between Emperor Xuanzong and his consort Yang Guifei includes the line, "You laughed once in the moonlight, and I forgot the empire." And yes, Yang Guifei, one of the 4 beauties of ancient China, her name still spoken with reverence and wistfulness. She captivated the emperor so completely that generals blamed her for his neglect of statecraft. During a rebellion, his army refused to advance until she was executed. A tragic ending, yes. But in poems, she lives forever, her fragrance still lingering in imagined chambers. You continue through carved screens into quieter quarters. A lesser concubine plays the Guqian eyes, closed fingers, plucking gently. Her song is a message, melancholic, slow, full of hope she dares not speak aloud. A eunuch listens nearby, pretending not to weep. Ah yes, eunuchs essential and feared. Fringe records suggest that some eunuchs formed deeply emotional and occasionally romantic bonds with concubines. After all, they were the only men allowed inside the harem walls. One scandal from the Ming era tells of a eunuch found hiding love poems beneath his robe. The punishment, banishment. The poems destroyed, or so they claimed. But a few verses resurfaced centuries later, copied into a private journal. Though we touched nothing, you are written on my breath. Outside the palace, love was often more flexible and more coded. In the cities, courtesan culture thrived. These were not mere entertainers. They were artists, literati, conversation virtuosos. A wealthy scholar might spend years courting a courtesan, with gifts, dinners, even published poems. And sometimes she'd still turn him down. The best among them were not for sale. They chose. One famous courtesan from Suzhou refused a prince's proposal, writing simply, "I am not a petal to be pressed in your scroll." Burn. In rural villages, intimacy was more rustic, but no less tender. Young lovers met at festivals under paper lanterns or beside rivers during Ghost Month. They whispered through bamboo flutes or carved messages into trees. One tradition involved secretly weaving a lover's name into embroidery, hidden beneath a sleeve hem, close to the wrist, close to the pulse. Even matchmaking had its quirks. During the Qing dynasty, some families hired professional go-betweens to negotiate marriage deals. These intermediaries were notoriously meddlesome, often embellishing resumes. One woman was described as serene as moonlight. She turned out to snore louder than thunder. The wedding went ahead anyway. But love, real love, wasn't always obedient. You walk through a scholar's study where an old man flips through a tattered book of CI poetry. He reads aloud a verse from a long-lost lover. His voice catches. He was 20 when she left. He is 70 now, but the ink still remembers. Queer love existed too, though often hidden in layers of metaphor. Male-male intimacy was noted in the imperial records, as early as the Han Dynasty, sometimes euphemistically described as the cut sleeve after a story in which an emperor let his lover sleep on his robe, cutting off the sleeve rather than wake him. Soft, regal, subversively sweet. Female-female bonds were harder to trace but hinted at in folk tales and private diaries. One Ming-era nun wrote about her sister in prayer, a fellow woman who shaved her head, at the same time held her hand through fasting, and built a private shrine for only us. Historians still argue whether this was spiritual love or romantic resistance. You pass a courtyard, where a couple performs a tea ceremony. Hands, steady movements, rehearsed eyes full of things never said. One pour, one sip, one glance. That's it. That's all. And it's everything. You climb now into a mountain pavilion at dawn. The mists rise. A woman stands alone watching cranes fly toward the sun. She once loved a soldier. He wrote her a poem. Then he vanished on the western frontier. She never married. She built this pavilion instead and reads his poem every year on the date of their first kiss. The ink has faded, but her memory hasn't. Because in imperial China, intimacy was discipline and art and longing carefully folded like rice paper. It was never loud, but it echoed forever. You turn away as the first light brushes the pagoda roofs. The tea cools, the brush dries. But somewhere beneath a pile of poems and petals, love waits with a steady hand and an unread reply. The mists clear and the path turns colder, rougher, mud-slicked, and wind-swept. You step into the world of the Norse, where intimacy doesn't come with silk robes or delicate verses, but with roaring fires, mead-stained oaths, and the creak of fur-covered beds in longhouses echoing with laughter and argument. Welcome to the Viking world, where love was forged in battle and cuddled beside storm-battered hearths. You enter a village along the coast of Norway sometime in the 9th century. The sea roars in the distance, as do the goats. But in here inside the longhouse, it's warm. It smells of pine smoke and dried fish and honestly unwashed linen. Romance. It exists here, sure, but it's pragmatic, blunt, and only slightly fermented. Let's drop a mainstream fact right away. Viking women, especially in Scandinavia, had far more legal and social rights than many of their medieval European counterparts. They could own property, initiate divorce, and yes, choose their partners. A well-off Norse woman wasn't a passive bride. She was a landowner with her own keys, sometimes literally. You hear arguing now, nothing serious, just a married couple bickering over who forgot to bring in the firewood. She wins. He sighs and pulls on his boots. Love Norse edition. Courtship here is fast and full of practical concerns. Does he have a boat? Does she know how to brew? Can they both survive a winter without stabbing each other with an antler comb? These are the questions. A wedding isn't just a love story. It's a contract between clans. You witness one now. The bride wears a red gown, her hair braided with bits of silver. The groom offers a sword hilt symbolizing protection and shared blood. They drink mead, laugh loud, and kiss like nobody's watching. Everyone is watching, and cheering, and probably slightly tipsy. Then comes the honeymoon ritual, a wedding bed surrounded by close family. No, they're not watching the consummation, just making sure it happens, or at least that the couple goes into the room. Fringe practice, absolutely, but attested in sagas and local lore. Speaking of sagas, this is where Viking intimacy truly shines. Love stories are sprinkled throughout Norse mythology and epic poems. Some tender, some violent, some very, very weird. One tale tells of a woman who carved a love rune into her lover's chest before battle. Another saga describes a man who crossed a mountain barefoot in winter just to deliver a message, "I still dream of your laugh." He lost 3 toes. Worth it. And then there's Freya, goddess of love, beauty, war, and cats. She gets around. She also weeps golden tears when separated from her husband. She's bold, powerful, and emotionally layered, exactly the kind of deity you want narrating your romantic disasters. You follow 2 young lovers now sneaking behind the sheep pen. She wears a wolfskin cloak. He's trying to remember the line of poetry he practiced earlier, something about her eyes being like thawed fjords. It sounded better in his head. In Norse culture, affection wasn't always loud, but it wasn't hidden either. A husband might carve his wife's name onto the prow of his ship before sailing off. A wife might stitch protective runes into her husband's cloak, believing her love could shield him from arrows. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes the arrow won. Historians still debate the prevalence of monogamy versus casual unions. The sagas include both. There are tales of faithful spouses and others where warriors had shield maidens waiting in every port. One preserved runestone reads, "Ragnhild placed this in memory of her beloved Halfdan. May the gods know that he held her only." Romantic extremely. Historically accurate, up for discussion. There are also queer threads, faint but visible. Loki, famously fluid in both gender and desire, gives birth to a horse. Yes, a horse. Don't ask. The point is, Norse mythology didn't shy away from strange forms of love, animal, divine, same-sex, or all 3. Human relationships followed suit. One poetic fragment hints at 2 shield maidens sharing a bed for warmth, then for joy, then for always. Scholars debate the interpretation. You decide to believe. You wander now into a burial mound. Inside, a woman buried with 2 swords. Unusual, suggestive. Was she a warrior, a noble? Did she lie beside her husband, or a sworn sister in arms? One theory posits the 2 women were lovers entombed together with honor. Another says they were rivals. But in Norse tradition, love and battle often walked hand in hand anyway. Back in the village, night falls fast. The hearth glows. A mother rocks a child humming an old lullaby about a sea god who fell in love with a fisher girl. The god offered pearls. She laughed and handed him a net. They married, fished together, and lived beyond the tides. That's the kind of love Norse stories admire. Not just the glamorous kind, but the enduring one. The fix your boots and carry your axe, and I'll save you the last bite of seal meat kind. You sit by the fire now, watching a man trace his wife's fingers with his own. She swats him away. He grins. They've survived 3 winters together. That's intimacy. That's victory. So when you leave this world smelling of smoke pine and stubborn affection, you carry with you one truth: for the Vikings' love wasn't soft, but it was strong, steadfast, sometimes poetic, and always real enough to carve into stone. The snow melts beneath your feet as you leave Viking shores, replaced by reed fields, sun-scorched roads, and the hum of chants rising from carved stone temples. You step into ancient Egypt, now a land of eternal monuments, shimmering heat, and the quiet power of intimacy scribbled on papyrus and painted into tombs. This is where love could outlast death if you wrote it carefully enough. You arrive near the Nile during a lazy afternoon. Papyrus boats drift past. Someone laughs nearby, low, easy, full of honey. The scent of lotus is everywhere. Egypt smells old, but not stale. It smells like memory, and like a memory, it clings. Let's open with a mainstream fact. Egyptians, unlike many ancient civilizations, celebrated romantic and physical love with surprising openness. Love poems from the New Kingdom, circa 1300 BCE, survive in abundance, full of playful longing and lyrical desire. One fragment, likely recited by a young woman, reads, "I wish I were your laundryman, so I could wash your linen and touch your thighs all day." Honestly, she understood the assignment. You find yourself in a scribe's home, now small but meticulously kept. His wife is grinding barley while humming a song he wrote for her. He was no priest or prince, but he carved her name onto the lintel of their door. Not just as a wife, but as a partner. Some homes recorded both spouses' names, an act of subtle devotion in a society so often tilted toward male remembrance. And the tombs, they tell the rest. In elite burials, couples are often depicted side by side, touching hands or seated together in a shared offering scene. One tomb inscription calls the woman the one who speaks, and he listens, which either meant mutual respect or a very diplomatic marriage. You slip now into the royal palace of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. The art here is different, softer, more naturalistic. You see the royal couple kissing their children, sitting close, exchanging affection with relaxed familiarity. One relief shows Nefertiti adjusting her husband's necklace. It's domestic, it's intimate, it's wildly unlike the stiff formalism seen before or after their reign. Scholars still argue whether this shift reflected their actual relationship or a political rebranding. Was it revolutionary love or strategic PDA? Regardless, the visuals remain stone-carved moments of tenderness that refuse to play by previous dynastic rules. Further along the corridor, a more private chamber holds the lesser-known but equally revealing world of Egyptian magic, specifically love spells. Yes, they existed. A surviving Ostrakhan shard of pottery includes a spell asking the goddess Hathor to bind the heart of a man and make him unable to sleep unless he thinks of the woman casting it. A bit intense maybe, but we've all known someone who needed divine assistance for their dating life. These spells weren't seen as evil, just emotional strategies. The heart, after all, was the center of thought and will in Egyptian belief. To capture the heart was to possess the mind, and possibly the inheritance. Outside the palace, the ordinary folk weren't shy either. You walk into a village near Deir el-Medina, the community of workers who built the royal tombs. Here, intimacy is everywhere. Couples bicker in love. One graffiti scrawl near a well reads, "Tahotep loves his wife more than fish." Another adds, "May she return home before the bread is stale." It's not Shakespeare, but it's real. And there's a surprising twist in this village: literacy was unusually high. Many of the tomb builders were literate artisans, and so were their wives. That meant love notes, informal contracts, and poems could pass both ways. One preserved letter from a woman to her husband reads, "You are the light in my courtyard." "Don't make me search in darkness again." Now that's a guilt trip that works. Let's talk about bodies. The Egyptians had no issue depicting or referencing them. Love poetry often included references to hair, skin, hands, mouths. Some even mention sweat not as something gross, but as something alluring. "Your scent is better than all ointments," wrote one poet, "your arms stronger than festival wine." Yet for all this sensuality, modesty, and propriety still existed. Couples did not cohabit before marriage. Adultery was legally punishable, especially for women. One fringe tale suggests that a pharaoh once sentenced a noblewoman to exile for a single stolen kiss, though the historian who recorded it clearly had a flair for drama. And maybe jealousy. You drift through a temple now where a priest pours water over a statue of Hathor, the goddess of music, beauty, fertility, and joy. She was the divine patroness of love in all its forms, and her temples sites of celebration. Dances, flute music, offerings of sweet cakes and garlands. Even now the walls vibrate with old laughter, but not every love was heterosexual or legal. There are cryptic texts, some half-burned, some found in hidden caches, that suggest same-sex affections were not unknown. One tomb belonging to two male officials named Nyankhnum and Khnumhotep depicts them embracing nose-to-nose, the most intimate gesture in Egyptian art. Are they brothers, lovers, soulmates? Historians still argue, but the tomb tells you this much: they were meant to spend eternity side by side. As the sun dips below the sandstone cliffs, you walk beside the Nile, past couples reclining under date palms, sharing flatbread, gossiping about neighbors. A man ties a bracelet around a woman's ankle. She steps on his sandal in return. They laugh. And here in the twilight of this civilization that measured time in dynasties and love in eternity, you understand something simple. Egyptian intimacy wasn't about secrecy or shame. It was about legacy, about engraving tenderness into limestone, about writing affection in ink that hoped to last forever. Because in this land of tombs and temples, love was the only thing that dared to speak from both sides of the veil. Now your feet drag a little. The stars are out. You've walked through palaces and peasant huts, across marble floors and mountain paths. But before we let this journey close its eyes, there's one last door to open, one last world to drift into the Americas, before conquest, before colonization, where intimacy pulsed in rhythm with the earth, with the sun, with the rain-soaked soil. You land in the Valley of Mexico. The air is thinner here, almost electric with memory. Welcome to the court of the Mexica, the Aztec Empire, where intimacy was deeply tied to ritual, to lineage, and to power that echoed in feathers, obsidian, and sacrifice. You move through Tenochtitlan, a floating city of canals and causeways alive with music and market noise. But inside the palace, the tone shifts. Here, the Tlatoani, the speaker-ruler, walks barefoot on polished stone, flanked by priests and advisors. He's a god-touched figure, yes, but he's also a man with wives. Many. A mainstream fact. Aztec rulers and nobles practiced polygyny, multiple wives ranked in status. The principal wife often came from a powerful allied family. Secondary wives were political gifts, peace offerings, or symbols of conquest. Each woman had her own chamber servants, and in some cases, personal landholdings. They weren't passive figures. They governed households, raised children, and influenced diplomacy. One fringe story preserved through oral tradition tells of a noblewoman who poisoned her own son to prevent him from challenging her favored stepson for the throne. It's a tale of ruthless maternal politics and deep devotion to a vision that went beyond blood. You slip into the women's quarters, now woven mats underfoot, faint incense still lingering in the air. A young wife practices dance. Another combs her hair with a sliver of shell. A third whispers prayers to Xochiquetzal, the goddess of love, fertility, and crafts. Her statues always smile slightly, knowing. Intimacy wasn't hidden here, but it was formalized. Couples were introduced through elaborate ceremonies, some arranged, others chosen. A ritual might include shared food, symbolic weaving, or the tying of garments to bind fates. One wedding record describes a noble groom receiving a cloak with two names stitched into it, his and hers, knotted at the center with a red thread. And yet true affection found its own way. A love poem from this era passed down in Nahuatl reads, "I carry your name in my breath, my flower, my song. When I die, I will return as a hummingbird to your garden." Now tell me that's not romantic. You follow a procession to the House of Youth, a place where elite sons and daughters were trained in etiquette, military arts, and sometimes courtship. Young nobles exchanged poems and tokens, occasionally slipping away during festivals under the pretense of flower gathering. Scholars still debate whether this was metaphorical. Most of them smile while debating. You move now into Maya lands, where intimacy takes a different form, celestial, mathematical, sacred. Carvings on stelae show royal couples in mirrored poses performing rituals that merged bloodline and cosmos. One pair, a king and his wife, kneel together, both drawing blood in honor of the gods, an act of both devotion and divine seduction. But not all Maya love was royal. In smaller villages, couples exchanged painted gourds, danced under moonlight, and left offerings beside river stones. A young woman might carve a man's name into bark and bury it under his sleeping mat, a charm to draw his affection. One recovered codex even outlines how to win back an ex-lover. Step 1, feed them spicy chocolate. Step 2, don't ask too many questions. And yes, there's evidence of queerness, though colonial erasure worked hard to smother it. Some Spanish chroniclers in their disapproving diaries noted unnatural practices among priests and warriors. What they described without understanding were likely relationships formed within ritual structures, spiritual, emotional, possibly romantic. In the face of fire and blade affection endured. That alone is a kind of defiance. You move north now to the ancestral Puebloans, where intimacy was quieter, woven into homes built from earth and stone. Matrilineal societies meant women held the keys. A man moved into her family's house. Children followed her lineage. Love was built from adobe, and son passed down through basket designs and lullabies. One grandmother's story, preserved through oral history, tells of her meeting her husband during a storm. He offered her a blanket. She offered him roasted maize. They stayed under that blanket for the next 50 years. Because sometimes love really is that simple. You sit now beside a fire watching sparks drift upward like messages to the stars. All around you are echoes of marriages arranged, of glances stolen, of perfumes dabbed behind ears, of ankles accidentally brushed under tables. And across empires and ages, one truth remains. Intimacy is always more than touch. It's presence, it's choice, it's risk. And sometimes, it's simply remembering the smell of someone's hair years after they've left. The fire dims. So now, at the end of this long, meandering walk through the shadows of palace chambers and the breath-warmed stillness of love letters never sent you exhale, let the weight of 25 empires melt from your shoulders. Let the noise fall away, the footsteps of concubines, the whispered confessions of monks, the silent exchanges across silken veils, all of it fading like perfume in a warm room. You're still here, of course, just quieter now. Maybe you feel your pulse slowing a little. Maybe the corners of your mouth softened somewhere between Persia and Kyoto. That's okay. You've seen how people loved fiercely, foolishly, patiently, secretly. You've stood beside tombs where devotion is carved deeper than bloodlines. You've heard lullabies hummed by queens and prayers muttered by lovers trying not to cry. You've walked through doors that don't exist anymore, but you remember them. And just before you sleep, let this thought settle in your mind like soft dust, no matter the throne, the temple, the language, or the law. Behind every closed door, there was always someone hoping they'd be remembered, not just for power or beauty, but for the way they made someone feel. Sleep well, traveler of hearts. End of script. Sweet dreams.